at 9:30 this morning, the retired Deputy Chief Justice Dikgang Moseneke will release that final report into the life Esidimeni arbitration hearings.
The Constitutional Court to hear closing arguments into Sassa grants crisis inquiry. Murder accused Sandile Mantswe to appear in court in connection with the murder of his girlfriend Karabo Mokwena. In your sports, Mamelodi Sundowns are through to the CAF Champions League group stages. Coming to you live from Johannesburg, this is Newsroom. Thank you very much for joining us. I'm Shante Yankees. Coming up, live coverage of the life Esidimeni proceedings, as well as the latest news from the continent. Do stay tuned. First things first, let's have a look at your top story. Well, leading at the hour, family members are anxious to know if Justice Dikgang Moseneke has recommended the prosecution of former Gauteng Health MEC Qedani Mahlangu and others. He is today expected to release a report on the life Esidimeni tragedy in Johannesburg. Mahlangu and others testified during the lengthy arbitration hearings on the Provincial Health Department's decision to terminate the long-standing contract with life Esidimeni. It resulted in the deaths of 144 mentally ill patients. The families of the victims also hope to find out how much they will receive in financial compensation. The latest on the story, we cross live to our reporter Griselda Lewis, who is in Parktown, Johannesburg, where the report on the tragedy will be released shortly. Very good morning to Griselda. Can you take us through the mood ahead of the report?
Well, certainly, Shante, anxious, as you've already described there in your intro. Well, the Gauteng Premier David Makura, as well as the Health Ombudsman Malagapuru Makhoba, as well as the family members, as you can see here behind me, have already arrived. And that anxious wait after so many months of tragedy, grief, and what they've described as one of the greatest tragedies in the healthcare system post-democracy in this country. Today at 9:30, we will hear from the retired Deputy Chief Justice Dikgang Moseneke what his final say is on the matter. You'd recall, of course, that the proposed settlement that was put on the table was 200,000 rand for each family for funeral costs as well as emotional shock. But we also saw in the last days of the hearings the Section 27, who are representing the majority of the families of the deceased, also wanting 1.5 million rand in addition to that 200,000 rand, and that being for constitutional violations. You recall, of course, when we heard in these hearings the constitutional violations of how some of these patients were moved from the Life Esidimeni facilities to the unlicensed NGOs, as I described in my earlier crossing, some of them tied at the back of bakkies, and some of them also transported in bakkies that were quite open and not fit for people in the condition that some of these victims were. And, you know, hearing gory details as well of how some of them died of dehydration as well as hunger. So I think really the tough task at the end of the day was in the hands of the arbitrator, the retired Deputy Chief Justice Dikgang Moseneke, and really trying to decide what cost would you put on the value of life. That's certainly quite a mammoth task that he had to achieve. And I did indicate a bit earlier on as well there, Shante, that this report comes at such a crucial time where we will be celebrating Human Rights Month. And certainly justice would need to be seen to be done in this instance, in that a clear message would need to be sent out about how public servants do treat people with conditions such as that of mental health. So that's what we will hear at 9:30. But this is just about the first part, I think, in terms of the kind of closure that these families will receive here this morning in terms of the compensation. But I think at the end of the day, in the many conversations that we've had with these family members, they say at the end of the day, what they would believe would be justice served in this matter is when those who they believe were responsible for this tragedy do face criminal charges. You'd recall towards the end of the arbitration hearings themselves, we got an update from the South African Police Service who were saying that they were going to wait for the transcripts of the arbitration hearings for them to also see if there was any information that came from those hearings that could assist them in their investigations, and that they were working very closely with the National Prosecuting Authority to determine exactly who should face charges pertaining to the Life Esidimeni arbitration hearing. So I think quite crucial, very anxious here this morning, these family members, exactly how much they will be compensated for this tragedy. But it certainly wouldn't be enough to bring back their loved ones who they say for many, many months they did not know where they were. They were not informed about the transfer of their loved ones, and they really do believe that the health department here in Gauteng could have done a much better job in the transfer of their loved ones to licensed NGOs, of course, which we heard during the course of these hearings were unlicensed. Gory details about how some of the monies from the Sassa cards of some of these victims were even being withdrawn after some of these families had died, some of the patients rather. And I think, there would be quite a scathing if, judging by what we've seen during the arbitration hearings, a scathing remark perhaps that will come from the arbitrator about how all of this unfolded and how the constitutional rights of some of the most vulnerable in this country were violated in a manner which had never been seen before. So a much anxious wait, I think, at this time for these family members, but very far from closure until someone is held to account for this tragedy.
Definitely, let's leave it there. Report on the ground, Griselda Lewis coming to us live from Parktown in Johannesburg as we await that hearing on the Life Esidimeni proceedings in just a bit. Well, the inquiry into the Social Security Agency Sassa's grant crisis will resume in the Constitutional Court today. Closing arguments will be heard over weeks of evidence as well as cross-examination that had been presented before retired Judge Barnard Ngoepe. Well, the court-mandated inquiry began in January. It's investigating whether former Social Development Minister Patricia de Lille should be held personally liable for the legal costs incurred in the protracted case brought by non-governmental organizations. In the last court hearing last year, Dlamini denied allegations that she stifled attempts to phase out the illegal cash paymaster services contract. This left the court without a choice but to allow an extension of the contract to avoid the non-payment of social grants to millions of beneficiaries. We'll also be bringing you live coverage of those proceedings this morning. Well, the trial of two men accused of kidnapping and killing a local pupil at Coligny started at the Northwest High Court in Mahikeng today. Peter Doravat as well as Philip Skieter are charged with the murder of 16-year-old Matlomola Moswe in April last year. Well, the two apprehended the teenager for allegedly having stolen a sunflower. They insist that Moswe jumped to his death from their bakkie on the way to the police station. However, an eyewitness alleges that he saw the teenager taking a severe beating before he succumbed to his injuries sustained during the assault.
All eyes will be set on the Northwest High Court as Doorwaard and Skitter are trialled for murder, with several witnesses expected to take to the stand. Moswe's death was the epicenter of a storm that erupted in Coligny, a small town about 100 kilometers away from the province's capital, on 24 April last year. Furious residents of the nearby settlement looted shops and set houses alight, enraged by the death of Moswe a few days earlier. It was clear that the town had been divided along racial lines.
I've always been a right-winger. And you know what? After 95, and we won the World Cup, I thought to myself, maybe you were wrong. And I think to myself, I will participate in building a new South Africa. Can you tell me if it's possible when something like that is happening to you?
In an attempt to restore the peace, Doorwaard and Skitter handed themselves over to police. After having spent more than a week in custody, Magistrate Makaola Foso ruled that there had been no concrete evidence against them at the time. Ruling that it was unlikely that they would abscond trial, he granted them bail of 5,000 rand each. Livid, residents took to the streets again, setting at least 3 more houses alight. With the town on fire, both literally and proverbially, North West's government sent a task team to Coligny and called community members to calm.
What we communicated to our people is some of the way forward that we are going to take. And secondly, to request them to come and respect the law.
Doorwaard and Skutte reappeared in court on several occasions, with charges of kidnapping, intimidation, theft and the unlawful possession of a firearm and ammunition being added to the charge sheet. Nicolene Smallman, SABC News, Mabatu.
For the latest, we are joined by SABC News reporter Nicolene Smallman outside the North West High Court in Mahikeng. Very good morning to Nicolene. Of course, this has been a very emotional issue and the community has also been so involved in the case. What is the latest?
Good morning. We arrived at the court about 20 minutes ago. It is very quiet. We were expecting to see family members here. Neither of the 2 accused are here, and we also don't see the family of the late Mosweu. The case has been set on the roll for the 30th of March. I checked with sources at the court who said that by Friday a judge had not been assigned to the case yet. So it is unclear at this stage what witnesses will be called to take the stand today. We will have to see what the day will bring.
Nicolene, can you recap for us why Peter Doorwaard as well as Philip Skutte are on trial?
They are being charged with the kidnapping and the murder of Mosweu following the incident in April last year. During other court appearances, more charges including the unlawful possession of a firearm and ammunition as well as assault were also levelled against the 2 accused.
Now, we do know that this story, once it broke to the media, made headlines, specifically on social media, with regards to what had actually been taken. Why has the case divided communities in the Northwest alongside the racial lines per se?
It created division because the 2 accused are white, and then black community members, or black residents rather, of Coligny came forward with a lot of allegations of racism by white fellow residents in Coligny itself, which have been denied by white residents, but it was clear that the town had indeed been divided along racial lines.
Thank you very much. That was SABC reporter Nicolene Smallman outside the North West High Court in Mahikeng. Nicolene Smallman for SABC. Moving on, the 6 suspects arrested in connection with the murder of 5 policemen and an ex-soldier at Ngobo in the Eastern Cape last month are expected to appear in the local magistrates' court again today. Well, 3 of them are applying for bail, while the other 3 have indicated that they do not want bail. A further 7 suspects were shot dead in a gun battle with the police at the cult's premises 2 days after the attack on the police station. Meanwhile, the South African Police Service in the Eastern Cape has held a cleansing ceremony at the town of Ngobo. They also announced plans to beef up security at the police station. Zandile Mantswe is expected to appear in the Johannesburg High Court again today in connection with the murder of his girlfriend Karabo Mokoena. Her child remains were found in a shallow ditch in Lyndhurst in April of 2017. Mantswe has denied killing Mokoena, but during his bail application, he said he disposed of her body after he came home and found that she had committed suicide. CCTV footage from Mantswe's apartment allegedly shows that they had been together on the night Mokoena went missing. Well, the case of a 41-year-old Pretoria man accused of raping a domestic worker and first forcing her to perform sexual acts on his dog in October last year is expected to resume in the Bronkhorstspruit Magistrates Court east of the city. Well, the charges that the man faces include rape, sexual assault and malicious damage to property. He has since abandoned his bail application. Cape Town Mayor Patricia de Lille's legal team has asked retired DA politician Sheila Kimura to recuse herself from the panel that will conduct de Lille's disciplinary hearing tomorrow. De Lille says Kimura is neither competent nor suitable to hear the matter, as she has not practiced law in decades. Kimura is a former attorney and was a deputy minister in the last National Party cabinet under former President F.W. de Klerk. She was a DA member of Parliament up to 2009 and then served as ambassador to Bulgaria after her retirement in 2013. De Lille also wants the hearing to be open to the media. The Parliament's Standing Committee on Finance will start probing former Sars executive Jonas Makwakwa this week following his resignation on Wednesday. Sars Commissioner Tom Moyane has finally given the committee the record of Makwakwa's disciplinary hearing after refusing to do so that since last year, citing confidentiality of taxpayer confirmation.
Jonas Makwakwa, the former head of business and personal tax at Sars, he resigned from Sars this week amid a cloud that is now still in question by an independent probe. He was reported by the Financial Intelligence Center for 75 suspicious and unusual transactions, some of which remain unexplained according to the reports. Yet a Sars disciplinary hearing cleared him of wrongdoing. Parliament's Finance Committee demanded a record of decision for clearing Jonas Makwakwa. Sars Commissioner duly handed over a report by an independent firm as well as a report on the internal disciplinary hearing. In the two reports, questions linger as to some of the unexplained transactions into Makwakwa's personal bank accounts. The reports also call into question how he bought a German sedan for his fiancée and fellow Sars colleague Kelly N. Elsky when he was being supported by his father. He also failed to declare his business interests with the taxman, yet he was found not guilty. The reason for that, he was not the only person to do this.
Yes, indeed. We received the reports, the Hogan's Logo report and the report on disciplinary inquiry into Mr. Makwakwa at 10 a.m. on Friday. We're now engaging with lawyers to see what, strictly speaking, belongs to the FIC and what are non-FIC matters, and how we proceed on Tuesday afternoon.
The DC did not focus on the transactions, but on breaking internal policies. A lot of the evidence finds wrongdoing, but he was exonerated on technicalities and legalities.
It would be inappropriate for me to comment on what's in the documents. It is for the committee to consider this collectively on Tuesday afternoon and then decide on the way forward therefrom.
While Sars Commissioner Tom Moyane has insisted that he's secured in his job, a lot of questions will be asked about his suitability to hold the position, given his role in the matter. Pulilani Philip, SABC News, Parliament.
Well, former President Jacob Zuma's outspoken son Edward Zuma has broken his silence on the NPA decision to reinstate corruption charges against his father. Well, Edward Zuma went on to say that he struggles to understand what the former president has done to deserve what he says is hatred. In a statement, Edward Zuma went on to criticize the country's judiciary, saying it's making life difficult for those who are not adhering to what he says is white monopoly capital and its offsprings. Some other news stories. Deputy President David Mabuza faces his maiden session answering oral questions in the National Assembly today. Mabuza will answer questions on matters of national and international importance. His appearance comes at a time when the controversial issue of land expropriation without compensation is a topical matter. Well, on our question of the day today, we're asking you, what do you make of the proposed revision of the drinking age limit that has now been from 18 to 21? You can send us your comments on @SABC Newsroom. We'll have a look at this and more after the break.
SABCnews.com is your one-stop digital portal to all the news you need. With a website that is easy to use on mobile, SABC News prides itself in being the primary source of public service content across multiple platforms. Watch live streams of all the big news events on the SABC News YouTube channel, which is one of the most viewed South African YouTube channels globally. And catch up on the best of SABC television and radio news. Follow breaking news on all of the SABC News social media platforms, interact with SABC News on Facebook, and stay connected on Twitter for the latest headlines and real-time updates by our reporters. SABC News, everywhere.
We make sure to be where news is happening,
both locally and globally. For the latest business news, stay with us.
From South Africa to the world, we've got all your latest sporting news.
Don't miss our weather updates every hour.
Stay tuned to News Today, Monday to Friday, from 3 to 5:30 p.m. here on SABC News.
When I was passing the casino, I said, that edge came, said, just try, you never know. You might go home with 80,000, times 4 the amount that you have. And that stupid day, I lost all my money.
Never allow glamorous lifestyles to push you beyond your means.
The awakening moment was that 2007, when I left my children alone. I realized this is hurting me.
Ask for professional help if gambling is controlling you. Know when to stop.
I faced reality that, for you there's no quick reach, so you just have to work hard. So it's gone.
For all your uplifting stories, catch Bupilong every Friday at 17:30.
Welcome back to SABC's Newsroom. Let's have a look at our newspapers that are making headlines this morning. We'll have a look at that. The Citizen saying why we get taxed. That's the headline there. And let's also have a look at what else is happening. This is the report that's following the National Prosecuting Authority against President Jacob Zuma. Of course, this is from his legal representative wanting to lodge a fresh bid in the court to have the case struck off the roll. Moving to Namibia, the Namibian says hundreds of Namibians of all walks of life turned up at Farm de Rust, some 40 kilometers west of Rehoboth in the Roundup region, for the funeral of Nora Skimming Chase yesterday. And finally, in Swaziland, the Swaziland Observer reports that a 14-year-old schoolboy from Lambo High School in the outskirts of Natlango killed himself at home, allegedly after being punished at school. What we can expect coming up after the break, Russian President Vladimir Putin secures yet another 6-year term in office.
Our Bill of Rights is the cornerstone of democracy. It enshrines the rights of all people in our country and affirms the democratic values of human dignity. SABC News celebrates Human Rights Month in the year of Madiba. #Know Your Rights.
Welcome to Media Monitor, the show that analyzes the big news stories that made headlines. We bring you robust discussions on stories that made headlines in the week, where we interact with media analysts to unpack these top stories. Join me every Sunday morning from 9 to 10 Central African Time as I bring you riveting news and analysis.
Stay tuned to Media Monitor every Sunday from 9 a.m.
When life takes a different turn.
If I didn't eat the spit, he was going to affect me.
Your will to persevere is ignited.
I'm not a professional speaker, but I'll try my best to give you a word of inspiration.
He was just trying to provide for his family.
If you can't accept it, change it. If you cannot change it, accept it.
And a new story begins.
Made a resolve to myself. I'm learning something new.
Upilong, every Friday at 5:30. Be part of the life-changing journey.
Our stories.
How do I begin?
Our lives. When all seems to fail, we will raise our voices a bit louder for our justice.
I went into absolute shock. My whole body was shaky. I couldn't hold a phone, but there he was. I couldn't believe the nonchalant that they were still in the area 2 weeks later.
And in times when the justice system is not able to help us with our individual battles.
I'm willing to do anything. What
are you doing? Nothing. Feeling sorry for yourself? No, it's not an option.
These are our stories on Cutting Edge Channel 404.
Zimbabwe opposition MDC battles to unite ahead of next year's election. Burundi's President Pierre Nkurunziza exchanges the constitution to extend his time in power. Russian President Vladimir Putin secures yet another 6-year term in office. Well, as political parties embark on election campaigns in Zimbabwe, the opposition party is battling to mend the divisions. In an exclusive interview with SABC News, leader Nelson Chamisa says those who are saying he is not a legitimate acting president are in the minority. He also told SABC News foreign editor Sophie Mokoena that former President Robert Mugabe will for the first time vote for the opposition.
It's a case for a country and a nation, for such elderly men in our country, our founding father, to be so angry. So we must be able to go and deal with that anger. I hope ED will be mature enough to try and engage him and hear what his views are, because also he has his issues, and I think as a former president and also as a liberation icon, we must be able to address some of his issues. So I feel for him because there are certain things where he feels betrayed, and betrayal is not good in leadership. But again, you know, he has done his bit. He must also allow us to try and correct where mistakes were made, so that he doesn't have them. The good news for you is, for the first time in the history of this country, President Mugabe is not going to vote ZANU-PF. Not only that, President Mugabe is going to vote for the opposition. And of course, the big question, the jury is still out, which opposition? I suspect is going to vote MDC.
Well, for the full interview, stay tuned to SABC News Channel 404 at 10:30 p.m. this evening. Same with African news, Burundi's President Pierre Nkurunziza has signed a decree setting May the 17th as the date for a referendum on a controversial constitutional reform that could keep him in power until 2034. Well, the government drafted reforms last year that would enable Nkurunziza to serve 2 7-year mandates from 2020. However, the measures have come under fire from the opposition and the international community, especially the African Union. Critics accuse 54-year-old Nkurunziza, who has led Burundi since 2005, of trying to stay in power for life. The disclosure by a Nigerian senator that lawmakers in the upper house of parliament receive over $37,000 each month, of course, to spend on personal expenses, has prompted outrage in the West African country where most people live on less than $2 a day. The amount has outraged the country where the United Nations estimates 70% of the population live on less than $2 a day. The revelation prompted that outrage in a nation where the elites have long benefited from the oil wealth of Africa's biggest crude producer, while most of the 190 million inhabitants live in poverty. It comes amid heightening scrutiny of President Muhammadu Buhari's record ahead of a February 2019 election. Buhari took office in 2015, vowing to improve the lives of ordinary citizens, but the IMF recently said people were getting poorer. A public outrage over the gap between the rich and the poor could become an election campaign issue in the coming months. Activists are calling for a review of cost and expenditure across the various arms of government.
I made it public so that in every possible way the chapter of secrecy can come to an end and Nigerians now can focus on other areas and sections or sectors of governance like the presidency and also state houses or assembly. And now that Nigerians know what the senators are earning, then they should also be asking, what is the running cost of the office of the president? What is the running cost of appointees of the president? What is the running cost of the ministers of the president? What is the running cost of state governors, of judges?
Morocco has proposed using 14 stadiums and putting aside a budget of around $15.8 billion to spend on infrastructure should it win the bid to host the World Cup soccer finals in 2026. However, Morocco will not build any new stadiums for the tournament, preferring to renovate and modify existing venues and add temporary capacity to others. The North African country is up against a joint bid from Canada, Mexico and the United States when World Soccer governing body FIFA's member countries decide in Moscow on the 13th of June who will host the tournament 8 years from now. At least 5 stadiums with largely temporary capacity will be downscaled after the finals to meet the specific needs of their local communities. Morocco's bid unsuccessfully to stage the 1994, 98, 2006 and 2010 World Cups. The country was a second to the US in 94, behind France in 98 and lost out to South Africa for the 2010 finals, the only time the event has been held in the continent. Staying with international news, Russia's Central Election Commission has announced that President Vladimir Putin won the vote by over 76%. Well, this guarantees Putin another 6-year term after winning the presidential election yesterday. Putin's hailed his victory as an expression of hope and trust. Addressing a mass rally in central Moscow, he appealed to the crowds for national unity. He said that this was a vote of confidence in him and in their great country. Putin, who has ruled Russia for almost 2 decades, recorded his best ever performance in the polls, but the turnout of 64% was less than the Kremlin had hoped for. The Putin supporters say he has made Russia stronger and blame the West for the new crisis in relations. Family members are anxious to know if Justice Tikang Motseneke has recommended the prosecution for former Gauteng Health MEC Qedani Mahlangu and others when he unveils his report on the life Esidimeni tragedy in Parktown, Johannesburg this morning.
We could not find her fingerprints. There's only bones left on her fingers, which means she was not cared for.
When they brought him, I screamed and cried the manner in which he was.
I want to apologize for the loss of life during the implementation of the project. I know that one life loss is too many.
Have a look at our question of the day that we're asking here on SABC Newsroom. What do you make of the proposed revision of the drinking age limit from 18 to 21? Continue to send us your comments on at SABC Newsroom. See, it seems to be something quite topical on Twitter. Tabo says, even if you can limit that to 50 but fail to do follow-ups, it helps us. Melvin says they're just wasting their time. And Fana on Twitter says 18 or 21 years doesn't matter to some of the club owners. I once told that teenagers do have a lot of money. You chase them, you chase your money. Very interesting views there on that proposed limit from 18 to 21. Let's have a look at our poll question today. Of course, it's around one of our big stories this morning. Do you think financial compensation will bring closure to the families of the Life Esidimeni tragedy? Well, with some of the votes that are coming in, just over 200 votes coming in there. 40% are saying yes, 60% are saying no. Barry Martin on Twitter says no financial compensation will bring closure to the families, but I also believe those responsible should face the law. Tabo says life cannot be redeemed, so this time people must at least understand the situation. So let the families accept the money, and Kledani Mahlangu and others got arrested and we move on with life. Lechasa says Kledani Mahlangu should be prosecuted, jailed and punished. Well, of course, so we're going to take a short break here on Newsroom. Stay tuned.
No. Yes. Yes.
Sports Live every Saturday and Sunday at 7:30 p.m.
Corruption both in the public and the private sectors needs to be combated.
Where there are clear cases of wrong that has been done, that must commence immediately.
Something is being done about corruption in our country.
Currency, even although it strengthened dramatically after the ANC's recent elective conference, could conceivably go stronger yet.
He had the soul that would not be for sale.
Stay tuned to Your World for your final news roundup, Monday to Sunday at 21:30. SABCnews.com is your one-stop digital portal to all the news you need. With a website that is easy to use on mobile, SABC News prides itself in being the primary source of public service content across multiple platforms. Watch live streams of all the big news events on the SABC News YouTube channel, which is one of the most viewed South African YouTube channels globally. And catch up on the best of SABC television and radio news. Follow breaking news on all of the SABC News social media platforms, interact with SABC News on Facebook, and stay connected on Twitter for the latest headlines and real-time updates by our reporters. SABC News, everywhere.
A very good morning to you, and thank you so much indeed for choosing Morning Live.
But I want to know the basic thing.
Griselda Lewis, SABC News, in Parktown, Johannesburg.
Zimbabwe, Mzondeli Mbeje, SABC News, Luanda, Angola.
Let's take a look at your market indicators.
Thanks for staying with Morning Live. Let's bring you your sports news.
Let's take a look at your satellite image.
Set the agenda for the day with Morning Live.
Welcome back. Let's have a look at some of your sporting highlights this morning. Start with some soccer. Mamelodi Sundowns are through to the CAF Champions League group stages. Sundowns overcame a rain-soaked Pretoria pitch and rugged opposition from Rayon Sports of Rwanda to win 2-0 after a goalless first encounter. In a match of end-to-end action, Uganda goalkeeper Dennis Onyango rescued the 2016 champions with several superb early saves, but pressure on attack as the half proceeded gave the visitors a headache, especially with an inspired performance by Gaston Sirino. The work finally paid off with a 34th minute goal from Wayne Arunza. In the second half, the wet pitch and a solid Onyango prevented the equaliser, while the Brazilians' attack remained focused on a 2-goal cushion, which was forthcoming when Spusiso Vilekazi struck the winner from a Sirino shot that hit the crossbar. A late red card for the host, Kalem Binyanmama, evaporated the last hope of the side making history for their country in the competition. Here is a full look at how round one in the Confed and the Champions League treated South African teams. Well, for the first time in the history of Premier Continental Club champions, Botswana, Guinea, Swaziland, Togo, as well as Uganda will have a representation at the mini-league stage in Township Rollers, Moroya, Mbabane Swallows as Togo and KCCA respectively. Angola's Primero de Agosto is also in the group stage for the first time since 1997. Holders Wydad Athletic Club of Morocco remains on course to defend their title. Meanwhile, the draw will take place on the 21st of March on Wednesday in Cairo in Egypt. Well, in the ABSA Premiership action, Bloemfontein Celtic striker Dumiso Mabena scored the goal that sank his former team Platinum Stars deep into relegation. Celtic win at the Dr. Molamela Stadium in Bloemfontein has put them to 8th on the logs.
Platinum Stars head coach Roger Disa was red-carded in their previous 2-1 loss against Maritzburg United. In his absence, assistant coach Mxolisi Dlamini took control of the team against Bloemfontein Celtic. It was a must-win for the Gwena, who are facing relegation at the bottom of the log. They have won only 3 after 23 matches. Celtic failed to use many opportunities at first half. The hundreds of Siwelele supporters using song and dance spurred their team on to a deserved 1-0 win at second half.
We will go on until it's mathematically not viable, but for now we're still in the Premier League.
Most football fundis are already saying Platinum Stars should start preparing for a new life in the NFD. However, it's not over yet, as there are still 6 matches to go before the end of the season. Tambashiba, SABC News.
So in rugby news, the Waratahs revived their Super Rugby season with a 51-27 win over the Australian Conference leaders, the Rebels, at the Allianz Stadium. They scored 5 unanswered tries within 20 seconds in the second half to end the Rebels' unbeaten start to their 2018 campaign.
The victory for the Waratahs comes after 2 consecutive defeats in their previous matches. They overcame a 17-point deficit with a spectacular second-half try scoring. The home side didn't start well, and a defeat looked very much on the cards. This after the Rebels charged to a 23 lead through first-half tries to Tom English, Amanaki Murphy and Jack Maddox.
And he gets it down, it's a try. And this youngster knows his way to the try line in 2018. Jack Maddox, that's his 5th try in 4 games.
However, a try by Lalakai for Katie before the half-time break was the inspiration they needed for a remarkable comeback.
And finally, this crowd at Allianz Stadium has something to cheer about.
The hosts then came out after the interval and produced their best half of the season. In a 20-minute domination, they ran riot as Rob Simpson, Mitch Short, Bryce Agati and Takele Nairavoro crossed the line.
And they're in again in the corner.
Bernard Foley converted all 4 of those tries and added a penalty as they went 41-20 up. The Rebels pulled a try back, but the Warriors added 10 more points with Nairavoro completing the half with another try in the final minute of the game. Lebantube, SABC News.
Golf now. Rory McIlroy staged a spectacular back 9 charge to claim a 3-shot victory at the Arnold Palmer Invitational on Sunday, the 18th of March, collecting his first PGA Tour win since 2016 and putting himself among the red-hot favourites for the US Masters. Well, to back of the overnight leader Henrik Stenson, when the day began, McIlroy overhauled the Swede with a brilliant error-free final round 8 under 64. Briton Justin Rose finished alone in 3rd, while Stenson 71 faded to the 4th. Tiger Woods, an 8-time winner at Bay Hill, had a 69 to cap another solid comeback effort and a tie for 5th. McIlroy arrived in Orlando, Florida, with plenty of concern over the state of his game, having missed the cut in 2 of his 4 PGA Tour starts this year, including last week at Valspar, with the best result, a tie for 20th. Well, the Northern Irishman hit 5 birdies over his last 6 holes, including a nerve-wracking clutch 25-foot birdie at the 18th to clinch his first PGA Tour title since the 2016 Tour Championships. However, the Northern Irishman was suddenly back in the US Masters conversation with another chance to complete the Rory Slam and his collection of all 4 major titles. McIlroy strung together 4 consistent sub-par rounds for an 18 under 270 total and a 3-shot victory over American Bryson. And let's move on now. Let's have a look at some other sporting stories. South Africa's Brad Binder began his 2nd season in Moto2 with a 6th place finish. He finished just behind his KTM Ajo teammate Miguel Oliveira, who ended in 5th after Francesca Bagnaia won the first race of the new season. Italian Andrea Dovizioso won MotoGP's season-opening Qatar Grand Prix for Ducati after a thrilling duel down to the line with Honda's reigning champion Marc Marquez. Valentino Rossi, the Italian great, starting his 23rd Grand Prix season at the age of 39 and with a new 2-year Yamaha contract freshly signed, joined them on the podium at the floodlit desert circuit. The Frenchman Johann Zarco started from pole position for the Non-Works Tech 3 Yamaha team and led until 5 laps from the finish when Dovizioso as well as Marquez made their move and pulled away. The Britain's Carl Crutchlow was 4th for LCR Honda, with Zarco dropping to 8th. Ventru of the United States and Buze Diriba of Ethiopia won the New York City Half Marathon. The men's race from Brooklyn to Manhattan Central Park was taken by True, who outsprinted his compatriot Dathan Ritain to win a time of 59 minutes 40 seconds. Ethiopia's Teshome Mekonnen finishing 3rd. Diriba ran away from America's Emily Sisson in the final stretch to win in a time of 1 hour 9 minutes 3 seconds. Caroline Bejekeli Krovdal of Norway came in 3rd. Some live visuals coming in. One person has been shot dead by the following police protest following a violent protest in Keiskamahuk in the Eastern Cape. Residents from 35 villages around the area are protesting over service delivery. Our reporter Busisiwe Jemsana is standing by to give us the latest. A very good morning to Busisiwe. Take us through the situation on the ground. Why essentially are residents protesting?
A rather sad morning in Keiskamahuk, Shante, as one of the protesters has been shot dead by the police. Early in the morning, protesters took to the street to protest over service delivery, many of them blockading roads, but then police started shooting and one was confirmed dead, whilst a number were rushed to the nearest hospital. We're not sure yet as to how many exactly, but we do know that some were rushed to the SS Gida hospital, and many have also been arrested and are on police custody here in Keiskamahuk. Just minutes ago, a number of residents marched to the local police station to demand that those that were arrested in the early hours of the morning be released. We also have a police helicopter that is roving around the town of Keiskamahuk to try and better manage or bring stability to the situation. I can confirm that it is chaotic in the streets of Keiskamahuk as they are burning tires and fuming residents, saying that those that were shot whilst they were running for their lives, and they do not understand why police used live ammunition to disperse the protesting crowds. But to tell us more, I am joined by one of the residents, Buyelwa Ulana, who's going to tell us exactly what happened in the early hours of the morning.
Morning, lady. During the early hours this morning, we saw the police from East London at about past 3. All the residents of Keiskamahuk were near the bridge. The police were very, very angry to us. They said we must take our cars. They take all the cars which were there. They took the keys. Those who were not having the keys, they tried to push the taxis of the residents of Keiskamahuk without having the keys of the car. I promise you, most of the vehicles are broken because they were taken unruly. The reason also we are here, we demand our needs. As from 2013, we did this. The premier was Ms. Noxolo Kivit. Noxolo Kivit promised us. As a result, she said, the foreigners or the working people of Keiskamahuk who are working in other areas or towns will see miracles at Kobo Kobo. But there were no miracles at all. That is why we've taken this so serious, because we didn't have any answer. Keiskamahuk is a dirty town. There are no roads. Our people are suffering. Roads outside communities, roads entering Keiskamahuk, roads entering hospitals, roads entering schools. I can say there are no roads at all. We're also having a problem here. There is a school, Steve Chwete School. They promised to build the school last year. There are no lights in this town. There are flight lights. Masipala promised us that the lights will be on last year, November, till now.
Alright, Nkosimam, buti eyona nto iye yakhokelela ekubeni kube kuyibe kanti amapolisa ayadutyulwa siyeva into yokubana adubule emva kokuba benibetha imoto estratweni. Ungangqina okanye uphike ezisitsholo?
Malum. Molweni mama. Lo uthetha ngugugu lethu kaSiwendo Goligweli. Ngusihlalo wombutho wabahlali balapha eQoboqobo bonke. Into eyenzekayo apha sibethwe ngamapolisa kuqala ngekhombi eyimpendulo. Polisa livele liphethe umpula ukhupha la ladubula abantu. Libazama baba basuke endleleni. And abantu mna ke kuba ndingaboni ndive izithonga. Ndenza umuntu othi umhlawumbe ndibone njani ndingaboni. Ndive izithonga zamapolisa abe kuthiwa imoto ikhombi impendulo esuke eMonti. Yiyo efike yadubula abantu abeqoboqobo. Ukoleka ke nophikisa lonto le ithi abantu baqala betha imoto zamapolisa ayonyani leyo. Amapolisa afike vele ngaba enomsino kakade safika apha. ulungisa kwakhona ke asiqali uba nematch apha eqoboqobo iyaqala uba khona enzeka lenzeke namhlanje kude kufe abantu beleqwa emlanjeni ngabapolisa asemonti athelekisa amapolisa walapha nabahlali because azanza lento yenze apha ayishiya phinda bheke emonti abe kushika apha kusifa amapolisa walapha eqoboqobo sidla ngokwenza imatch apha namapolisa ekhona esijongile abone basimosha into asenze nix ayomatch ayonto yokuqala le and le petition famba inikezwa uOscar Mabuyane famba inikezwa uPhumulo Muswane ngo11 o'clock sibabhalele sabaxela bamlindela bona apha ngoba umasipala umeya no speak akhona isethela nabo ngoba kudala besiza apha ngomlomo bengenzi kwanto safuna ukunikela ngoku usihlalo wephondo plus no premier.
All right, but well, those are the two residents who are denying that they were shot because they were throwing stones at cars. They are saying the police started shooting at them without them triggering them to do so. I can confirm that it's a total shutdown in Kamauk as there are no schools and no shops are open. We've just seen the forensic pathology services making their way to the place of the scene where one of the protesters was gunned down by police. We've also spoken to police who say they can confirm that indeed there is one person that has been shot and the number that have been arrested, though they are not at the stage of confirming the number of those who were shot. We'll be keeping a closer tab with them to tell us exactly what has happened and what led to the live ammunition that was used. We will be keeping you up to date with the developments as they happen, but for now it is back to you in studio, Shante.
Thank you very much for giving us updates there on that protest there in the Eastern Cape. We will give you more updates throughout the course of the morning. For now, though, let's cross over to your weather forecast. Phil is standing by.
Yeah, thank you very much. Let's take a look at that weather for today. South Africa expecting some showers and thunder showers for the morning along the southern coastline of South Africa there. That's primarily in the Western Cape, but it's mostly already burnt out along that southern coastline. We're going to see just a partly cloudy day continuing further in that southwestern area. Some showers and thunder showers forecast for the interior of the eastern regions of South Africa for this afternoon and this evening. And we're also expecting quite a bit of rainfall extending through to other parts of the southern hemisphere of Africa and also through towards Tanzania for today. Expecting quite a lot of rainfall there. Now, into tomorrow's weather, we're still expecting showers and thunder showers in the same area, slightly less for the morning for tomorrow, but once again we're seeing South Africa expecting showers and thunder showers primarily concentrated in the eastern interior of the country, but for tomorrow we're also seeing that towards some eastern parts of the coastline there. A very strong low pressure system that in fact is a tropical cyclone moving just southeast of the Madagascar island there, and of course that did bring in a lot of rainfall for today, and tomorrow it's going to continue to do so. So let's take a look in a little bit more detail what's going on for today. 24-degree highs forecast for Cape Town, temperatures ranging through the higher 20s for the northeastern parts of the country, and the southern interior remaining quite chilly with temperatures in the lower 20s for maximums today. Bit of wet weather in Pretoria, 29 degrees Celsius. Gaborone and Seroe also expecting some wet weather with temperatures ranging through the 30s, and a hot day still forecast for Beitbridge with temperatures up around the 40-degree mark. Now, Harare peaks at 29 degrees Celsius for today. It's not expecting any rainfall at the moment. We are expecting showers, though, throughout Madagascar for today. Now, remember that tropical cyclone moving just south of that region, that strong depression there is continuing to affect the area and just bringing in that rainfall, some windy conditions in some areas as well. But for the moment, we're just seeing it moving south and moving away from the island, which is great news there. Nairobi, 23 degrees, Mombasa, 32, and Dar es Salaam, 31. It's going to be a warm day along the coastline, a little bit cooler in the interior, wet weather continuing in that region as well. And then, of course, wet weather extending through towards Kinshasa, Brazzaville, Bangui, Yaoundé, all these areas expecting at least isolated, if not scattered to widespread showers. Now, Bangui is still very warm at 37 degrees Celsius, and remember, that's going to result in some rather high levels of humidity. As we move on into the spring season and continue into the coming up weeks in the northern hemisphere spring, we're going to see things getting warmer and warmer in that northern region there. For today, we're still expecting low pressures over that region to bring in some showers. Some showers forecast for that southern region of West Africa as well, and then rainfall extending through towards Addis Ababa and other parts of Ethiopia, not only for today but into tomorrow as well. You can see that strong low pressure system just moving through the Mediterranean Sea. That's going to bring in those showers. Quickly, some temperatures now. Khartoum 37 degrees Celsius, Massawa at 31. Temperatures ranging through the high 20s and early 30s for this region, and we're going to see conditions which are bringing in slightly warmer conditions around Cairo at 24 degrees. Dry conditions there as well. This is where we're going to leave your weather for now. Stay with us here though on the SABC.
Family members of the Life Esidimeni tragedy victims will any moment from now know if the former Gauteng Health MEC, Kodani Mahlangu, and others will be prosecuted when the report of the tragedy is released. And of course, these are just the live visuals that are actually coming through from Parktown, Johannesburg. The big question today, will today bring closure? We're going to have to wait and see. The Constitutional Court is currently hearing closing arguments into Sassa grants crisis inquiry. But accused Sandile Mantswe to appear in court in connection with the murder of his girlfriend Karabo Mokoena. In sports, Mamelodi Sundowns are through to the CAF Champions League group stages. Just gone 10 o'clock, coming to you live from Johannesburg. This is Newsroom. Thank you very much for tuning in. I'm Shante Yankees. Of course, do stay tuned. Coming up ahead, live coverage of the Life Esidimeni proceedings, as well as the latest news from across the African continent. With that being said, let's have a look at your top story at 10 o'clock. Well, family members are anxious to know if Justice Ikang Mosaneke has recommended the prosecution of former Gauteng MEC Kodani Mahlangu and others. He is today expected to release a report on the Life Esidimeni tragedy in Johannesburg. Mahlangu and others testified during the lengthy arbitration hearings on the Provincial Health Department's decision to terminate the long-standing contract with Life Esidimeni. It resulted in the deaths of 144 mentally ill patients. The families of the victims also hope to find out how much they will be receiving in financial compensation. The inquiry into Social Security Agency Sassa's grant crisis is currently underway in Midrand. Closing arguments will be heard after weeks of evidence and cross-examination presented before retired Judge Bernard Ngoepe. Well, the court-mandated inquiry began in January. It's investigating whether former Social Development Minister Patricia de Lille should be held personally liable for the legal costs incurred in the protracted case brought by the non-governmental organizations. In the court last year, in the last hearings, Dlamini denied allegations that she stifled attempts to phase out illegal cash paymaster services contract. Well, this left the court without a choice but to allow an extension of the contract to avoid the non-payment of social grants to millions of beneficiaries. We'll also be bringing you live coverage of those proceedings this morning. Well, the trial of two men accused of kidnapping and killing a local pupil at Coligny starts at the Northwest High Court in Mahikeng today. Peter Duravat as well as Philip Sketer are charged with the murder of 16-year-old Matlomola Mosweo in April last year. The two apprehended the teenager for allegedly having stolen a sunflower. They insist that Mosweo jumped to his death from their bakkie on the way to the police station. However, an eyewitness alleges that he saw the teenager taking a severe beating before he succumbed to his injuries sustained during the assault.
All eyes will be set on the Northwest High Court as Doorewaard and Sketer are trialled for murder, with several witnesses expected to take to the stand. Mosweo's death was the epicenter of a storm that erupted in Coligny, a small town about 100 kilometers away from the province's capital, on 24 April last year. furious residents of the nearby settlement looted shops and set houses alight, enraged by the death of Moshwe a few days earlier. It was clear that the town had been divided along racial lines.
I've always been a right-winger. And you know what? After 95, and we won the World Cup, I thought to myself, maybe you were wrong. And I think to myself, I will participate in building a new South Africa. Can you tell me if it's possible when something like that is happening to you?
In an attempt to restore the peace, Doorwaard and Schutte handed themselves over to police. After having spent more than a week in custody, Magistrate Makaola Foso ruled that there had been no concrete evidence against them at the time. Ruling that it was unlikely that they would abscond trial, he granted them bail of 5,000 rand each. Livid, residents took to the streets again, setting at least 3 more houses alight. With the town on fire, both literally and proverbially, North West's government sent a task team to Coligny and called community members to calm.
What we communicated to our people is some of the way forward that we are going to take. And secondly, to request them to come and respect the law.
Doorwaard and Schutte reappeared in court on several occasions, with charges of kidnapping, intimidation, theft and the unlawful possession of a firearm and ammunition being added to the charge sheet. Nicolene Smallman, SABC News, Mabatu.
It is our lead story this morning. We now cross live to those much-awaited Esidimeni hearings.
Families of the deceased.
Yes.
Good morning, Justice. I'm one of the evidence leaders. Unfortunately, everything Luciana couldn't make it today.
Very well.
Morning, Justice. I'm here on behalf of 4 of the family members of the deceased.
Yes. Good morning. Good morning, Justice. I appear on behalf of the government on brief by Waxman's attorneys. Good morning. I'm prepared to down. And the rest of the team, I welcome you all. The judgment runs into nearly 100 pages and covers over 226 paragraphs. What I intend to do this morning is to read what I consider to be the essential parts of the judgment in order to inform you and indeed to inform our nation how I've arrived at the decision that ultimately I will read out into the record. So bear with me. I will be reading from the text of a judgment, and those who have a real penchant for detail, I invite you to find the judgment. It might make good bedtime reading. This is a harrowing account of the death, torture, and disappearance of utterly vulnerable mental health care users in the care of an admittedly delinquent provincial government. It is also a story of the searing and public anguish of the families of the affected mental health care users and of the collective shock and pain of many other caring people in our land and elsewhere in the world. These inhumane narratives were rehearsed before me, the arbitrator, in arbitral proceedings I'm about to describe. It is now undisputed that as a result of their move out of the Life Esidimeni facilities after the 1st of October 2015, 144 mental health care users died, and 1,418 were exposed to trauma and morbidity, amongst other results, excuse me, but survived. Of the known survivors, the state informs that the whereabouts of 44 mental health care users remain unknown. The Life Esidimeni arbitration was established following Recommendation 17 of the Health Ombudsperson, titled The Report in the Circumstances Surrounding the Deaths of Mentally Ill Patients, Gauteng Province, hereinafter the Ombuds Report. The parties referred their disputes to arbitration before a single arbitrator. This they did subject to a written arbitration. The parties also settled a pre-arbitration minute, which regulated the exchange of pleadings, procedural matters, admission of evidence, inclusion of extensive bundles of documents appointed by the arbitrator, who would serve as evidence leaders. The arbitration proceedings started on the 9th of October 2017 until the 9th of February 2018. They were open to affected families, the public, and all media. The hearings set for 43 days and an additional 2 days on which legal argument was presented. During that time, 6 took to the stand and gave evidence under oath. Of the 60 witnesses, 12 were senior state officials, and these included Dr. Tiago Ephraim Selebano, Dr. Ernest Kinosi, Ms. Qetani Dorothy Mahlangu, Dr. Gwen Ramokopa, Ms. Barbara Chrissy, Premier David Makura, National Minister of Health, Dr. Aaron Motsoaledi, and earlier still, Dr. Morgan Mkachwa. They included the former head of the Department of Health, Gauteng Province, the current acting head of the department, the former member of the Executive Council for Health, Gauteng Province, the current member of the Executive Council, member of the Executive Council for Finance, the Premier, as I've intimated earlier, and the national ministers. 5 witnesses were middle management government employees, and 1 was a senior officer in the South African Police Service. The managing director of Life Esidimeni at the time of the Marathon Project also testified. Witnesses included 3 managers or owners of non-governmental organizations to which mental health care users were moved. "22 were family members of the deceased persons, and 9 were family members of surviving victims. 59 affidavits were submitted by Section 27 in relation were handed in by the Legal Aid South Africa. In addition to the arbitration record, which runs into 3,000 pages, a total of 173 documentary exhibits were admitted to the record. But what are the issues? The core dispute to be determined by the arbitrator is the nature and the extent of the equitable redress, including compensation due to mental health care users and their families who were negatively affected by the Marathon Project that led to the closure of Life Esidimeni mental health care facilities after the 1st of October 2015. A prominent feature of the reference to arbitration is unqualified admission by the state that it is liable to recompense the affected mental health care users and their families individually or as a group. On this aspect, the arbitration agreement reads, the following group will be entitled to equitable redress arising from the alternative dispute resolutions. The groups I describe, and I will not read the agreement any further. And by agreement amongst the parties, the final version of Annexures A, B, and C, containing the respective claimants entitled to compensation, determined by the arbitrator, were duly submitted to me before the end of the proceedings. Excuse me. There is thus before me no contest about the identity of the people entitled to equitable redress in respect of each affected mental health care users who was represented in and were part of the arbitration. The arbitration agreement also records that deaths of the mental health care users were, and I quote, not natural, but caused unlawfully and negligently, close quote, by the employees of the government, and that, open quote, liability for the loss of the affected families falls to the government. The quote ends. The liability of government is not in issue, the agreement further reads, to be determined or contested in this process. Following in the footsteps of the arbitration agreement, the pre-arbitration minute again records emphatically that the liability of the state is admitted and is not in issue. From the foregoing, it is plain that all elements of delictual liability and of the entitlement of all claimants to equitable redress are admitted in so many words. For its part, the government contends that it is liable to compensate the families of the deceased and the mental health care users who survived the marathon project and their families for estimated funeral expenses and common law general damages arising from pain, suffering, and emotional shock, but nothing else. To that end, the government tendered a global amount of 200,000 rand, which some claimants accepted. For their part, all claimants, in slight variations, were emphatic that beyond the general damages for which the government is obviously liable, the pervasive, egregious, uncaring, and wanton violation of constitutional rights of all mental health care users affected and their families call for equitable redress, which must include constitutional damages. The government resists this claim. After all said and done, that is the residual but intractable difference and dispute I'm called upon to resolve. Now, the arbitration process, albeit unusual, was also intended to achieve related objectives of closure. These objectives were to uncover the full circumstances of the death or survival of the affected mental health care users, to afford the affected families the space to mourn or grieve as they related what they knew about the demise or survival of their loved ones, to give the state decision makers an opportunity to account for the deaths and torture of mental health care users who were in their care, to grant an opportunity to political representatives of the state to tender public apologies and hopefully facilitate emotional closure on the part of the affected families of mental health care users who died and those who survived the ordeal of the marathon project. Whilst the oral and documentary evidence is truly vast, it is important that I, at the outset, caution against an expectation of an excessive rendition of evidence, which is readily available on the audio recordings and transcripts. Given limitations of space and time, that would not be practicable. Only evidence strictly related to the remaining crisp dispute between the parties will be considered. But who are the parties and what are their claims? Having introduced the broad character of these proceedings, it is convenient to describe the parties to the arbitration and their claims. That description is one naturally finds in the arbitration agreement. In broad terms, there are two sets of parties. There are claimants made up of families of affected mental health care users who died or survived during the Marathon Project. And they may be divided into three parts. First, 74 claimants listed in Annexure A. And in paying respect to them, I'm going to call them by name, each by each. Felicity Adams, Diedrich Johannes Buerta, Terence Mapesa Chaba, Friedrich Kollitz, Mel Lanz Conway, Franz Decker, Tembisile Lillian Dlamini, Maimuna Dupré, Nelly Johanna Dutoy, Joseph William Golden, Joseph Gumete, Sizwe Tabang Hlachwayo, Nicholas Anthony Janik, Jacobus Johannes Janse van Rensburg, Amiruddin Jardine, Daniel Charles Josiah, Maureen Kunjwa, Masweet Kozwale, Christina Lale, Matofela Leroabe, David Letwaba, Hendrik Rantupi Mabue, Peter Mdluli, Virginia Macpella, Matsubani John Mahluku, Christopher Makoba, Happy Makubela, Raisibe Rahab Mangena, excuse me, Nathaniel Soli Mashiro, Eric Mangana Mashilwani, Josephina Mhlongo, Jabulani Amos Mkize, Rainok Ncube, Jabulani Godfrey Mnisi, Sidumedi Solomon Mwatse, Lucky Jeremiah Mudise, Christopher Mokhwerani, Jonas Mudike, Mokaneng Benika, Ntswelingwe Mokheti, Sophia Manyana Molefe, Mameisi Sina Mosalo, Caswell Musiani, Matlakala Elizabeth Mutswahai, Sana Mpiti, Siabulela Roger Msimanga, Emily Mtembu, Pio Sibusiso Mtombeni, Peter excuse me, Mvundla, Jerry Nganga, Frederick Nelson, Vuyo Aaron Ondwani, Musetlani John Badi, Julian Anthony Peterson, Deborah Petla, Janet Sipati Bilani, Charity Ratsotso, Jean Banana Rantwise, David Johannes Senegal, Busisiwe Shabalala, Muhammad Adil Sharif, Joy Nomsa Simamani, Alfred Sitole, Begumzi Sitole, Phoebe Jasfine Marcia Sodom, would you pardon me one moment? I just want to make sure I've read out all the names of the first category of claimants. From the inception of the Marathon Project and throughout the struggles of these families to resist the government plan to move their loved ones out of life as Esidimeni, during the arbitration, they were represented by Section 27. In these proceedings, Advocate Adila Hasim and Advocate Nikki Stein, suitably supported by attorneys, appeared for them. They seek the following relief in the arbitration: compensation for funeral expenses in the amount of 20,000 rand, compensation for emotional shock and psychological injury in the amount of 200,000 rand, and compensation for constitutional damages in the amount of 1,500,000, of which is claimed for each claimant, and 500 rand is claimed to be paid into a mental health system in Gauteng as a donation by the families in memory of each deceased to improve the care of mental health care users in the province. They also claim counseling and support services provided for and funded by the state, and in other equitable redress, they claim for a recovery plan to address the systemic failures in the department referred to by the MEC Ramokgopa in her evidence. They claim the establishment of a training for government officials on unconditional on rights and ethics, and the government to make public the outcome of various investigations into officials and bodies involved in the project. The second set of claimants is 4 family members whose loved ones died during and as a result of the Marathon Project. They are represented by attorneys, Herter Spies, and for them in the proceedings appeared Advocate Dirk Groenewald. Again, to show respect, I will read their names individually. They are Jabulani Mhlongo. They are Thabo Munyani. They are David Khotso Mpofu. Yako Stalls. They claim funeral expenses in the amount ranging from 20,000 to 40,000, general damages of 150,000, constitutional and punitive damages for 1.5 million rand to vindicate fundamental rights of the claimants, and of the amount claimed, 250,000 rand to be paid into the Office of the Health Ombud and for a number of reasons that are set out in the claim. And in other form of redress, equitable redress, they require the government to submit the record of proceedings to the South African Police Service and specialized investigating units to assist in their investigations, and that the government, that the Gauteng Department of Health, must make public a plan and a strategy within 3 months of the award, through which its employees must be made aware of the constitutional, statutory, and ethical obligations towards patients, and in particular, mental health care users. The last category of claimants are 68 in number, and their particulars are listed in Annexure C. They are mental health care users who were inter alia caused trauma and morbidity, but survived the marathon project, and that includes their families. They were represented by the Legal Aid Board South Africa, and for them in the hearing appeared Advocate Lila Krause and Advocate Nzame Skibi. And again, by name, they are Agnes Sitale, Anthony Singh, Aisha Boswell, Bekumuzi Nchangaze, Bongani Celeste Mukwena, Brenda Mufokeng, David Chauke, David Mapela, Edward Mufokeng, Elizabeth Zwane, Francina Mutlabi, Francois Bezaidenhout, Franz Chester, Freddie Yaka, Gabriel Lucas Munaheng, George Shai, Gay Daniel Kanza, Hendon Number, Jubilee Mackenzie, Jerry Mowa, Jonathan Zadla, Julia Khatle, Julian Holwani, Kabelo George Mokatsi, Sbongile Baloyi, Sandra Davids, Agnes Juanita Mlojwa, Musidi Nchangaze, Lulu, Michidilas Mukwena, Mutlaba Mufukeng, Washington Chauke, Puleng Miller, Matsidiso Mufokeng, Dipuo Betha Hassim, Grace Mutlabi, Gerardus Bezaidenhout, Elizabeth Chester, Tandi Selina Silinda, Itumeleng Chabalala, Pumla Shai, Sophie Kanza, Sonwabo Namba, Priscilla Mackenzie, Sarah Bayeni, Johannes Dladla, Lesego Baloyi, Mary Fletcher, Lucky Albertina Molatsi, Kathy Reed, Kutso Maditsi, Lazarus Muleleki, Lehlohonolo Francis, Lindy Mokwatlo, Lord Michael Sito, Maggie Joyce Dlamini, Mandla Khadebe, Maspiriti Mufokeng, Matthews Moloi, Macmillan, Makosizwe Nkosi, Mtuduzis Kakani, Messi Mutswasile, Michael Mabizela, Michael Sipiwe Chabalala, Kanyusile Mkansana, Moffat Lukele, Moses Mulobi, Mzwandile Elliot Mpambo, Mkahlululeng Ntsobe, Nonjabe Kayakazi, Nora Tebe, Ntombi kayise Zanele Magaga, Ufense Nkuna Philemon Ramakapula, Philip Dace, Reginald Thomas Zamisa, Samson Mokwena, Siabulela Dlamini, Shadrach M. Kula, Sizwe Nkosi, Skhumbuzo Hlatshwayo, Solomon Mokwatlo, Siphiwe Nkosi, Stephanis Hoffman, Stephen Mano, Themba Mthethwa, Victor Truter, Vusi Mapisa, Men Marin Reed, Mdiani Maditsi, William Muleleki, Mary Usupeng, Solomon Mokwatlo, Mapo Sito, Jim Dlamini, Nomsa, on behalf of Madintle Khadebe, Mwelo Dikeledi Mofokeng, Mojale Fasitunya, Christine Kosi, Sebusisa Sekakani, Onika Dalasile, Patience Chilwani, Elizabeth Malkas, Lungiswa Banzi, Ivan Lukele, Anamulobi, Mordecai Mpambo, Talita Mabizela, Nomvula Nonjabe, Ntabise Mokale, Fakazile Dibetswe, Stephen Mahlangu, Tabiso Ramakhopola, Lina Tays, Susan Kuni, Selina Liruma, Cindy Swandaba, Yvonne Nemkula, Nompilo Nkosi, Phumzile Dlamini, Lindo Mkwatlo, Joyce Mokwela, Marina Mayberg, Jaco Lucas Mokoni, Sipho Mthethwa, Andrew Peterson, and Patience Sithole. I know I read both the deceased and claimants in error, but I'm sure we can bear with that. Now, these claimants seek R1 million in respect of general damages for shock, pain, and suffering of each mental health care users, and for special damages of the families of each mental health care user, 5,000 rand for specific damages, for replacement of clothing and other valuables lost, 50,000 for future medical, psychotherapy, and counseling expenses, 1,000 rand costs incurred to locate mental health care users after they were discharged from life as Esidimeni, and 1 million rand for constitutional damages. Now, the respondents against whom these claims are made is the government of the Republic of South Africa, represented by the National Minister of Health, the Premier of Gauteng, a member of the Executive Council of Gauteng Department of Health, and they are represented by Waxman's attorneys. And for them, in the proceedings appeared Advocate Tebogo Hutamo. I've intimated earlier that the government has tendered to pay all claimants up to 200,000 rand for funeral expenses and general damages under, as they put it, the common law. All claims, barring the survivors and their families, have accepted the offers. What is plain is that the claimants seek, in addition, constitutional damages. Ahead of damages, the government has resisted strenuously. It seems plain that in order for me to reach a just and equitable redress, including compensation, and in particular whether claimants have made out a case for compensation because of constitutional breaches, I must examine the facts surrounding the termination of the contract with Life Esidimeni, followed by a description of the extraordinary context of the deaths that occurred and the morbidity, the trauma, the suffering, the torture endured by the survivors. And immediately thereafter, I'll be required to identify the applicable law, as I'm duty-bound to, and thereafter determine equitable redress. Very brief background is what I now tend to. Now, the genesis of this terrible tale of death and torture of mental health care users was the termination of the contract between the Gauteng Department of Health, hereinafter the department, and Life Esidimeni. The contract, which had been in operation for over 30 years, was ended on the 29th of September 2015 by formal notice authorized and signed by the head of the department, Dr. Tiago Ephraim Silibano, hereinafter Dr. Silibano. On the 21st October 2015, then member of the Executive Council, Ms. Qetani Mahlangu, hereinafter Ms. Mahlangu, announced the formal end of the contract of service. In her evidence before me, Ms. Mahlangu was adamant that the decision to terminate the contract was taken by a collective. In contrast, Dr. Silibano claimed that he signed the notice ending the contract only because he feared his political principal, Ms. Mahlangu, on whose instructions he claims he terminated the contract. Now, the contract was ended on a 6-month notice. This meant that all mental health care users would be moved out of Life Esidimeni facilities by the 31st of March 2016. Random and mass discharge of patients on orders of the department started immediately. The date for the closure of the facilities was later extended to the 30th of June. The end of the contract precipitated the move of 1,711 mental health care users out of Life Esidimeni between October 2015 and the end of June of 2016. Mental health care users were moved to hospitals, to non-governmental organizations, handpicked by the department, or a few to their family homes. Before and after the termination of the contract, the families of mental health care users, civil society, professional bodies, clinicians within the department made attempts to persuade the department to devise a plan that would protect the rights and meets the needs of mental health care users being moved out of Life Esidimeni. The department did not heed any of these pointed warnings of potential harm to mental health care users. Ms. Mahlangu, Dr. Silibano, and the former head of the Mental Health Directorate, hereinafter Directorate, Dr. Makhabu Manamela, obstinately went ahead with mass removals without involvement of and consultation with and consent health professionals. And as a result, at least, as I've said earlier, 144 people in their care died. And barring the missing patients, just over 1,400 patients survived the torturous conditions after their forced displacement from Life Esidimeni facilities. Now, the high watermark of the response of these 3 high-ranking government officials is that they had no reason to believe that the displaced mental health care users would die or suffer severe ill treatment and torture. On the facts as a whole, this response is improbable, and so improbable that it must be false, and I find that it is false. To this important matter, I will revert later. Ms. Mahlangu, Dr. Silibano, Dr. Manamela gave 3 reasons for the termination of the contract with Life Esidimeni: the policy requirements to institutionalize users, the Auditor General's concern regarding the duration of the contract with Life Esidimeni, and budgetary constraints. Unsurprisingly, the reasons are neither cogent nor rational. I deal with each only briefly. This is so because towards the end of the hearing, the testimony of the Minister, of the Premier, of the member of the Executive Council for Health, and member of the Executive Council for Finance, convincingly demonstrated that all three reasons put up by the leaders of the department were fabricated, they were false, they were disingenuous, and advanced in order to conceal the true reasons for ending the contract and moving the patients. The department claimed that the termination of the Life Esidimeni contract was in line with the National Mental Health Policy Framework and Strategic Plan 2013-2020, hereinafter a policy framework. It is so that policy framework envisages the deinstitutionalization of mental health care users following the development of community-based services. The virtue of properly curated community of house-based health care seems self-evident, even to me as a lay person in mental health. But the Marathon Project was not the deinstitutionalization the policy framework imagined. First, placing mental health care users outside institutions is neither inexpensive nor easy. Professor Makoba, the health ombudsman, pointed out that only Italy and France have successfully deinstitutionalized mental health care users, and that doing so is expensive. But put plainly, deinstitutionalization may not be, and ordinarily is not, a cost-saving measure. Professor Freeman develops the same theme, pointing out that the global experience and numerous research studies had shown that displacing patients from institutions should not be used to save money, as this inevitably results in people with mental illness being further abused, increased hospital admissions, and early mortality. The claimed deinstitutionalization was riddled with several defects. The money supposedly saved by the department did not follow the mental health care users. Instead, there was an increase in the allocation of psychiatric hospitals and policy transfers to district mental services. And the facilities that were supposed to care for the Life Esidimeni mental health care users. Moreover, neither the mental health care users nor the non-governmental organizations to which they were transferred were adequately prepared for the move. Instead, the move was rushed, with non-governmental organizations accepting users without having the resources or infrastructure to do so. Mental health care users were not appropriately assessed by clinicians, let alone multidisciplinary teams of healthcare practitioners. Their move from Life Esidimeni was coercive and thus did not follow normal clinical protocols of discharging patients, and their placement into non-governmental organizations appeared to be random. Mental health care users were not assisted to integrate into their communities and to retain access to health care services that they obviously required. The new living environment at non-governmental organizations was no less restrictive than a hospital, but significantly more disadvantageous. Most mental health care users were moved to NGOs far from their family homes, removing them from the communities into which they were supposed to be integrated. Some of the NGOs were far from any community, and users were therefore isolated from their families and other people. Both Ms. Mahlangu and Dr. Silebano claimed that a reason for termination of the contract with Life Esidimeni was the need to comply with Auditor General's requirements concerning evergreen contracts. None of the two provided evidence to support this ostensible reason. To the contrary, member of the Executive Council for Finance, Ms. Barbara Chrissy, told the hearing that she reviewed the Auditor General's management letters to the Health Department for the years 2013 and 2014 up to 2016-2017 financial years, and was unable to find any reference to or concern over the life Esidimeni contract. It is in the managerial letters that any instructions to review contracts would ordinarily appear. Both Ms. Mahlangu and Dr. Silebano called the name of the Auditor General in vain. The third reason given to the cancellation of the contract of life Esidimeni was resource constraint. But the decision to end the contract in order to save costs ran at complete odds with the report commissioned by the department from the Health Advance Institute, in which the Health Advance Institute found that the life Esidimeni contract provided good value for money, a finding Dr. Silebano remembered well and accepted, although he noted concerns with the level of certain clinical services provided by life Esidimeni facilities. As for Ms. Mahlangu, she claimed rather surprisingly and unconvincingly that the department had kept Health Advance Institute report away from her. She could not explain why the department she headed would conceal a diagnostic report of this importance, given its relevance to the looming cancellation of the life Esidimeni service level agreement. Her stance begs the question, why did she not demand a diagnostic report before pulling such a big trigger? Did she not care to make a decision which is evidence-based? The decision disregarded the provincial instruction to cut only non-core costs. Ms. Chrissy explained and produced documentary evidence to show that the provincial directive was to cut only non-core costs and to fight corruption. She stated, and I quote, "Treasury has never demanded that any department cut core services." The quote ends. She emphasized that the delivery of health was a core service, not liable to cost containment measures. Of particular importance is that the evidence shows that the department was not under budgetary pressure. Ms. Chrissy explained that the department's allocated budget was increasing in the years before and after the transfer of patients. The current member of the Executive Council, Dr. Gwenra Mokopa, however, confirmed that the mental health budget was, in particular, at the relevant time decreasing, as was the proportion of provincial departments' budget allocated to mental health care. I readily accept that on all accounts, the department, like the rest of the state, faced financial constraints. Its allocated budget seemed to fall short of its actual expenditure, and the department experienced annual overruns that were rolled over to subsequent financial years. Dr. Silebano and Ms. Mahlangu were at pains to explain that the overruns were due to the ever-increasing health expenditure triggered by an ever-growing population and users in the Gauteng province. In so doing, they sought to show an obvious need for cost containment, and that in turn justified their decision to shut down life Esidimeni services to mental health care users. However, both of them told the hearing nothing about what emerged from Ms. Chrissy's evidence, and records the budgetary and financial crisis within the department, that the budgetary and financial crisis within the department was mainly due to mismanagement, to incompetence, and possible fraud. The financial management appears to have been rife. The increasing accruals and significant irregular expenditure, up to 6.8 billion rand, of which was referred to special of which 1.6 billion was referred to special investigating units for investigation. We are yet to hear about the outcome of that investigation. The department asserted a need for cost containment, and yet over the relevant period, its action breached the cost-cutting directives of the National Treasury, spending huge sums of monies on consultants. All the details are set out in a footnote in the reasons for this award. And despite her claim that cost containment was a major driver for terminating the contract, Ms. Mahlangu testified that she did not see the actual numbers of the budget for moving mental health care users from life Esidimeni, and did not know how the 190 million budget for mental health care users was spent. She could not say whether actual savings were realized. At life Esidimeni, the department paid 320 rand per mental health care user per day. And yet, those transferred to other state health care facilities were to incur substantially higher costs for care. And on the department's own version, most mental health care users were meant to be transferred to state facilities at a rate almost 6 times more than the cost of care at life Esidimeni. Was cost saving the true reason for terminating the life Esidimeni contract? In the end, the largest majority of mental health care users were transferred to NGOs, and this move was meant to cut costs to 112 rand per day. At NGOs, mental health care users were expected, with that meager amount, to obtain medication from state health facilities and to be attended to by healthcare workers in state facilities. So the 112 was supposed to be used to cover accommodation, meals, toiletry, clothing, healthcare workers required for day-to-day care of mental health care users. NGOs were also expected to collect mental health care users' social grants and to get donations. Dr. Silibano acknowledged that the subsidy that the government paid to NGOs was hopelessly insufficient. And despite the insufficient subsidy, the actual amount paid to NGOs in the end was significant. The department paid 47.5 million rand on Ms. Creasy's evidence, and of which Dr. Ramakgopa acknowledged that some payments were made to non-governmental organizations to which NGOs were not entitled, including payments to NGOs long after they had been closed. Now, users and their families and the department ended up paying a much higher price for the termination of the contract with life Esidimeni. Apart from the loss of 144 lives, the project itself and the need to return mental health care users to life Esidimeni and Selby facilities after the release of the Ombuds report was costly. The Director General of the National Department of Health, Ms. Precious Matsuso, rightly observed that the cost savings cannot be the real reason behind the marathon project. What then was the real reason? The reasons that Ms. Mahlangu and Dr. Silibano and their department have advanced for terminating the service contract with life Esidimeni have been shown to be untrue. Also, the reasons are not properly related to the outcome they claim they were pursuing. In short, besides the reasons being untruthful, the decisions on which the reasons are based are irrational and therefore in blatant breach of the law and the Constitution. In any event, resource restraint cannot constitute an acceptable justification for failure to protect and realize constitutional rights if the organ of state concerned has budgeted according to mistaken understanding of the constitutional and statutory obligations. And mental health care users arrive at non-governmental organizations. And there, what do they find? The indispensable starting point is understanding the role of NGOs in the life of Esidimeni death and torture is the Ombuds report. The Ombuds found that all 27 NGOs to which the mental health care users were moved operated with invalid licenses. More than 95% of the deaths happened at NGOs. The highest number of deaths occurred at 5 NGOs. These were precious angels. Coligny Care and Rehabilitation Center. By that one should understand Siabadinga and Enka. Then at Musehu and Takalani. Then at Sepong. And then at Have Ziba. Now these NGOs, more than others, turned out to be sites of death and torture of mental health care users under their care. According to the Ombuds, these NGOs had neither the basic competence and experience, nor the managerial capacity, nor the fitness for purpose, and were often poorly resourced and overcrowded. Below, I detailed only some of the treacherous features at NGOs, at which the state chose to entrust the lives of mental health care users. The plan was not always to move mental health care users into NGOs. But once the contract was terminated, Dr. Manamela formulated a plan for the move of all users by the 31st of March 2016. Then the plan was to use renovated hospital wings and NGOs. The renovation of unused wings never came to fruition due to, as she claims, projected expenses of undertaking such renovations. As such, there was, as Dr. Silibano described it, a deviation from the plan. Despite this deviation, a plan on paper to build 900 beds was finalized only in November 2016, after at least 90% of the deaths had occurred. Simply stated, Ms. Mahlangu, despite her claim that she was ignorant of the fact, Dr. Silibano and Dr. Manamela, without a proper plan or beds, ordered the mass discharge of affected mental health care users from Life Esidimeni to NGOs, where, as we know now, many died and others survived the torture. It will be remembered that Dr. Silibano looked into the possibility of the department buying the Life Esidimeni facilities. He said the department has sufficient funds to buy and was provided with 3 options for payment terms, but he did not pursue this idea. He could not say why he did not proceed with the patches option, which was well within his power. Given the lack of available hospital beds and the failure to pursue the option of buying Life Esidimeni facilities, the department resorted to NGOs. There was no open procurement process for the services required. Instead, NGOs were first invited to a meeting in September 2015, which was chaired by Dr. Manamela, and were told that Life Esidimeni contract would be terminated by the end of 2015-2016 financial year. When meetings with NGOs were called, they would be called by the districts and included old NGOs and any other person who might listen. The NGOs were told that the department would welcome expansion of the old NGOs. Professor Makhoba explained that people were told at these meetings that, and I quote, this is an opportunity to provide empowerment to people who can modify their homes in order to accommodate the patients, close quote. He thought that people were excited by this project. Professor Makhoba observed that correctly that NGOs were mysteriously selected. There were never any clear selection criteria. There seemed to be no requirement for premises, staff, qualifications, or experience. The second is that there were already other NGOs in the province that would have had the experience to look after the patients. But instead, new ones were brought in. Professor Makgoba's findings were indeed spot on. Ms. Jacobus, the Deputy Director of Mental Health Services, reported to Dr. Manamela. She candidly testified that the normal assessment of process of conducting pre-audit visits and then NGO audits were not completed during the marathon project. And instead, alternative processes were introduced on Dr. Manamela's instructions. Ms. Jacobus was aware that NGOs did not comply with the licensing requirements. Prior to issuing the licenses, she told Dr. Manamela, who ignored the warning, and instructed her to finalize the licenses, citing instructions, I quote, from above, that had to be followed. This is after Dr. Manamela testified that her team, under the leadership of Ms. Jacobus, assessed NGOs, prepared licenses for signature, and followed the law. She even claimed to have seen all the assessment reports before issuing the licenses, including a checklist to show the NGOs met all the requirements. But she did not request to see the financial statements. Now, to cut to the chase, Ms. Jacobus told the hearing that there were no assessment reports of aspirants' NGOs, that the licensing process connected to the marathon project was unlawful and knowingly fraudulent, and that much she admitted in the course of her testimony. According to Ms. Jacobus, evidence, and indeed it seems plainly so, her boss, Dr. Manamela, knew of the fraud in the licensing process, but went ahead to issue licenses to NGOs where ultimately death and torture ensued. Now, aside the licensing fraud and the unlawfulness at the point of issue, the licenses had many other defects. They reflected incorrect addresses, incorrect mental health care users classifications. They were all backdated to the 1st of April 2017, regardless of the date of signature. All licenses were issued by Dr. Manamela, despite her not having the legal authority to do so. And at least some, if not all, licenses were reissued by Dr. Silebano following his interview with Professor Makgoba, and were backdated to the 1st of April 2016. Now, Dr. Silebano admitted to having reissued and backdated licenses after he had closed NGOs concerned. NGOs were licensed for their planned number of beds, and not for beds actually available. NGOs did not even have premises, let alone beds at the time. They received the license from the department for 150 beds, which didn't exist, at premises which did not exist. Some of the NGOs were not licensed at all. Some NGOs were licensed for more people than they could accommodate, while others accepted more people than they were licensed for. And then comes the mass transfer. Sadly, even in the face of vacuous and irrational reasons for terminating the Life Esidimeni service level agreement, the inadequate assessment of NGOs and the unlawful and fraudulent issuing of licenses, Dr. Manamela and her directorate, with the knowledge and under the direction of and support of Ms. Mahlangu and Dr. Silebano, went ahead and carried out the mass transfer of patients out of Life Esidimeni facilities. The success of the department in the High Court litigation on March 2016 between itself and the South African Depression and Anxiety Group emboldened it to carry out the mass transfers of mental health care users to NGOs. Between October 2015 and April 2016, about 16 patients per month were transferred from Life Esidimeni to NGOs. Resolutions from a meeting in the MEC's office on the 8th of April 2016 shows that 950 mental health care users needed to be moved to NGOs by the end of that month. Even given this resolution, the big migration was between May and June 2016, when 500 and 800 patients were transferred respectively. The Ombud named this a stampede. On June 2016, in the middle of the stampede, South African Depression and Anxiety Group sent a letter to Dr. Silebano, Mr. Musinochi, the project leader of the Marathon Project, and Dr. Manamela, raising desperate concerns about the move of mental health care users without the knowledge of their families. NGOs that, I quote, are little more than empty houses filled with beds without any professional care, without security and supervision, some without sufficient beds for mental health care users to sleep on, close quote. Poor conditions at Cullinan Center, adult users being moved en masse to Baneng, non-governmental organizations not being paid, mental health care users being sent to facilities who were unable to care for them, poor communication, and, open quote, extremely high rate of negative outcomes, including relapse and deaths following the relocation of users, close quote. So these leaders of the project were warned, and thoroughly warned. Dr. Silebano responded, saying that, I quote, I am sure the colleagues who have been copied will engage with the contents of your email. Close quote. No, Mr. Musinochi will provide me with a status report, and you may talk to him directly. This is a painful chapter of all of us. Close quote. But he did nothing about that. The South African Depression Anxiety Group received no further responses to this letter, and the mass transfers were not stopped. They continued regardless. How could Ms. Mahlangu, Dr. Silebano, Dr. Manamela be believed when they told the claimants, and indeed our nation, that they could not reasonably foresee the imminent torture and death of mental health care users, that they and the government they worked for were duty-bound to care for? The move was described as chaotic. The mental health care users left unattended outside Life Esidimeni facilities, and multiple NGO personnel were there picking patients and vehicles sent to collect them. While support from a family is important to ensure that a user is able to settle into a new environment, many families testified that they had not been informed of the move. Some were told that the transfer would happen, but not when or where their loved ones would be moved. Life Esidimeni itself was not informed where individual users would be taken to. All this meant that tracking users when family members contacted Life Esidimeni was very difficult. Users were transferred from Life Esidimeni to NGOs in departmental vehicles or in vehicles owned by NGOs. There was no written plan for the transformation of the patients, but Mr. Musinochi said that Mr. Malotana from the Provincial Emergency Services handled the logistics. A document submitted by Ms. Mahlangu during her testimony shows that many of the NGOs, in fact, used their own transport. In one instance, people from NGO organizations arrived at Life Esidimeni to collect mental health care users in a bakkie. Dr. Mkhatshwa instructed that the bakkie be turned away. Dr. Mkhatshwa explained to the department that it was unacceptable for NGOs to arrive at Life Esidimeni facilities to choose mental health care users, and instructed Life Esidimeni facility managers that NGOs must not be permitted to come and choose mental health care users. His instruction was to no avail, because the department persisted in sending NGOs personnel to come and choose and cut away patients. Here is one disturbing example of arbitrary, randomized mass discharge and transfer of mental health care users. Coligny Center facility staff were instructed by the chief executive to go to Esidimeni in Waverley to collect 10 mental health care users, who they were to assess to determine whether Coligny Center was the appropriate facility for the patients in question. They had not been provided with the identity of the patients that they were to collect. Coligny Center staff erroneously drove to Esidimeni in Randfontein. When they arrived there, they were met by a group of 26 mental health care users and were instructed by the department officials to bus them anyway to Coligny Center on the basis that they had arrived with a 27-seater bus. On the evidence, none of the patients were assessed individually and discharged or transferred by an authorized clinician. Now, apart from the mass moves out of Esidimeni, mental users had to suffer trauma, anxiety of being moved from place to place, from one NGO to another. For instance, users who were moved to Coligny were again moved out of Coligny Center to one of his resident NGOs, and then to Precious Angel. Ms. Franks, the owner of Anchor, testified that 30 Anchor patients were transferred to Precious Angels without any identity documents within 2 weeks of their transfer from Coligny Center. She said she knew this was wrong, but she was under instructions from the department. Ms. Charity Ratsotso was moved from Esidimeni to Coligny Center and then to Anchor. Mr. Caesar Tlachai was moved from Esidimeni to NGOs in Hammarskraal, to Coligny Center, then to Anchor House. Ms. Devlin Ndlovu testified Coligny Center took 21 mental health care users from Precious Angels when it closed down. So mental health care users were moved from place to place, randomly and regardless and without clinical intervention. Clinical records, medication, other belongings did not move with the mental health care users. Dr. Manamela blamed Esidimeni for the move of mental health care users without medical records. Dr. Mkachwa explained, however, that when mental health care users left Esidimeni facilities, they had a file with a picture of the mental health care users, the identity document, and a discharge summary. They did not hand over the full medical records, as a volume of files would have made this impossible, but ordered for the department to attend the facilities and photocopy the medical records. The department did not take up this offer. The consequences are obvious. And Professor Makhoba corroborated this evidence, finding that mental health care users were transferred with summary notes and records that could have been interpreted by a health-related qualified person, but not any person. Also, various NGOs reported to families that their loved ones had arrived without any records. So the users were set up for death without mental records. The evidence reveals severe problems in accessing medication once the patients had been moved. Dr. Mkacha testified that Esidimeni gave patients medication for between 28 days, up to 27 and 28 days, depending on whether they were going to a state facility or non-governmental organizations. He explained that Esidimeni was unable to provide the amount of medication that would ordinarily provide for each mental health care users due to the large number of users being moved all at once. Dr. Manamela claimed the transfer plan was that NGOs would be linked to local facilities for sourcing medication. But, she said, the clinics and the managers in some areas were, and I quote, not so much supportive, close quote, and that this may explain probe in accessing medication. The more sensible and candid explanation is by Mr. Musinogi, who observed that the former Esidimeni patients' medication would need to be prescribed at a psychiatric hospital and would not be accessible at clinics. And therefore, the overall evidence reveals not only problems in assessing medicine, but also serious breaches in clinical protocols, identifying, labels, storing medication for multiple patients in NGOs. There were no competent healthcare givers to prescribe, identify, provide appropriate medicines, if any, to patients. There were no records tracking each patient's dosage of medication, if any. In addition, the NGOs who did not have identity documents had problem in assessing care at hospitals if users became sick. There were no resident or visiting clinicians at all NGOs. Mental health care users had no access to doctors, let alone psychiatrists, except when taken in at a nearby hospital. The damning point is this. Dr. Manamela, Mr. Musinogi, with the instructions and knowledge and support of Ms. Mahlangu and Dr. Silibano, devised a plan for the mass displacement of mental health care users from Life Esidimeni. This they did without and proper notice to and consent of the patients, let alone their families. On their instructions, the patients were loaded on buses, on open trucks, and driven to NGOs unknown to the patients or to their families. Patients tightly held to their meager personal belongings. The evidence suggests that the patients were visibly harassed or anxious. Some were conveyed with their hands and feet and both tied. On all accounts, the conveyance was cruel. It was inhuman and indeed deeply degrading. All this without prior and continuous clinical assessment of the patients, without useful or any medical records, without access to clinical and other medical care, and without access to appropriate prescribed medication. Many of the destinations of the mental health care users, as I've just described, were plainly treacherous, and the evidence suggests that they may be properly dubbed death traps and sites of torture. And now look briefly at the conditions at the NGOs themselves. The chaotic process of moving mental health care users to NGOs, the lack of appropriate assessment to ensure sufficient qualified decent infrastructure and programs, and the late payment of non-organization payment to NGOs meant that the conditions at NGOs were poor and entirely unsuited for the care and medical needs of mental health care users. Families who testified at the hearing and those who submitted affidavits found that the food at the NGOs was of bad quality, insufficient, and in some instances had to be provided by family members themselves. Many NGOs appear to have problems in assessing medication, mental health care users, and they all required psychiatric and physical support which they did not have. And from then I go on in great detail to describe the circumstances of mental health care users at all the NGOs where mental health care users were trapped and ultimately died. But what was the response to these deaths? One of the first mental health care users to die was Miss Deborah Petla. She died on the 26th of March 2016 at Takalani. The post-mortem report revealed that she passed on with brown paper and plastic in her stomach. After Ms. Petla, at least 142 more mental health care users died, because there was one who died ahead of her. That's why there are 142. The Ombudsman found that 72% of the deceased, as I pointed out earlier, had been at or died at only 5 NGOs. Professor Makhoba has correctly found that users transferred from life Esidimeni hospitals, 2.4% died, as compared to a death rate of 10.4% of the users who were transferred from life Esidimeni to NGOs. A major attribute of the months following the deaths is the misinformation on the part of the department about how many there were deaths and the in which the deaths occurred. The progress reports compiled by the project team did not deal with the deaths. What is clear, however, is the attempt to obfuscate. By the 1st of August 2017, 51 people had already died. And yet, on the 11th of August 2016, Ms. Mahlangu's response to a question in the provincial legislature did not mention deaths. Ask why, she says because. The question was not specifically asked. This is significant because we know that Dr. Manamela compiled the legislative response, where the deaths of 51 patients out of their PET project, the marathon project, not of sufficient gravity to be reported to the legislature when the treatment of mental health care users was specifically probed by the legislature. Asked the same question during the hearing, Ms. Mahlangu, Dr. Silebano, and Dr. Manamela pleaded ignorance. They claimed that nobody told them of the deaths. So many deaths under the care of the department died, and they say they never heard of the deaths. I'm sorry, so many users under the care of the department died, and the department says they never heard of the deaths. This answer is as improbable as it is untrue. All three key decision makers in the marathon project, in the evidence, sought to escape the inevitable and the foreseeable results of their reckless and unlawful plan to displace mental health care users from life Esidimeni facilities. The deaths were reported to the department, as well as to numerous other people and bodies. Section 27 wrote to Ms. Mahlangu, informing her of several deaths on the 1st of September 2016. Section 27 received no substantive response to the letter, having received an initial response of acknowledgement from Ms. Mahlangu, and that she would look into the issues they raised. Ms. Mahlangu testified that she responded to Section 27's letter on the 1st of September by referring it to the relevant official. And these are Dr. Silebano and Dr. Manamela, even though she had undertaken to revert to Section 27 herself. This, she said, was her normal practice. A little over a month later, on the 13th of September 2016, Ms. Mahlangu answered another legislative question and announced 36 deaths had occurred. The Ombudsman found that by this point, 82 people had in fact died. The Ombudsman acknowledged in his report that at that point, he was still counting deaths because he had been unable to obtain accurate information from NGOs and from the department. Professor Makgoba interviewed Dr. Silebano and Dr. Manamela only after the 23rd of November 2016. Dr. Silebano told him that there had been 36 deaths or 40 deaths. Dr. Manamela said there had been 48 deaths. 3 days later, the Ombudsman asked Ms. Mahlangu, and she said there were 36 deaths. When Professor Makgoba asked Ms. Mahlangu why the numbers she reported on the 13th September 2016 were so low, she responded that the numbers had become a political game. At that stage, he told Ms. Mahlangu that there had been 77 deaths. And, I quote, she just kept on saying, but you know, if I released the numbers, it would have been a political game, close quote. It is indeed remarkable that in the face of such a carnage of patients under the direct care of the department, none of the 3 top leaders, the architects and implementers of the Marathon Project and the enormous project team, had no grasp of the numbers of deaths. Did they choose not to know, or were they downright untruthful? On the totality of the evidence, I conclude that Ms. Mahlangu, Dr. Silebano, and Dr. Manamela falsely claimed ignorance of actual number of deaths at NGOs, even as they were responding to Professor Makhoba's inquiry. And when Ms. Mahlangu addressed the provincial legislature, she was simply concerned more about the political game than the truth and the plight of the dying mental health care users that the department's plans had so ruthlessly displaced. Another misinformation that emanated from Ms. Mahlangu, Dr. Silebano, and Dr. Manamela was that the deaths that occurred were not related to the move, but ought to have been expected given the mental health care status of the deceased. All 3 of them, in slightly varying formulations, said, I quote, mental health care users die. Well, that must be true. All human beings die at some stage. But here, matters were plainly different. All evidence points to a natural cause of death. That is the finding of the Ombud, and one that the government has conceded. Again, the concession by the government is properly made. The circumstances of all the deaths were questionable and indicated at the very least cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment. The causes of death as reflected on the death certificates varied, but included pneumonia, neuroglycopenic, brain injury, chronic hepatitis, which caused liver failure, septicemia, and severe dehydration. And despite the circumstance of death, most were classified as being due to natural causes. The result was that post-mortem examinations were not conducted in the vast majority of deaths. And I go on to describe a variety of users and the circumstances in which they were found. And I won't repeat them here. I hope you'll find time to be able to read there, all of that. Mercifully and rightly, in these proceedings, the wranglings about the cause of death does not arise. The state has considered that the deaths of concerned medical health care users were not natural deaths, but caused by the unlawful and negligent omission or commissions of its employees, starting with Ms. Mahlangu, Dr. Silebano, and Dr. Manamela, and the personnel of NGOs who were agents of the state and who bore the same duty of care and the same statutory and constitutional obligations as the state towards the mental health care users who were in their care, as well as their families. Once the death occurred, then the search for the living and the dead happened. The lack of dignity accorded the mental health care users when they were alive continued to their deaths. About this, Professor Makhoba testified, I quote, there was a total disregard, I think, for human dignity and human respect in terms of patients even after death. Many patients, many relatives did not know where their loved ones were, and many, I think, are still somewhere looking for them and not having received answers proactively. They had to dig. They had to go knock at many doors, and I think that was traumatic and frustrating over time. The code ends. A recurring theme throughout the evidence of the families is that although some knew of the intended closure of life as Esidimeni, they were not provided with the final details relating to the transfer of their loved ones. After the moves, most families were not informed and spent months searching for their loved ones. Many families were not told of the whereabouts of their loved ones and had to call many of the NGOs and conduct a long search to establish their whereabouts. Some of the NGOs were far from their families, making visiting difficult, specifically because of long distances and high costs of travel. Dr. Manamela's claim that families who were accessible knew is contradicted by many families whose contact details were in files of their loved ones at Life Esidimeni, but who did not receive notification of the move. Also, her assertion that families were offered transport to visit their relatives is also disputed by families. In any event, if Dr. Manamela's claim were true, there would not have been so many unclaimed deceased bodies in the hands of NGOs. Her claim, in most cases, is plainly false. I again resort to only a few anecdotal examples of gruesome disrespect in life, even in death. Mr. Ngondwani found out December 2015 that Life Esidimeni was clothing. Although his son, Vuyo, was moved to Cullinan, the family was told he had been moved to Takalani. They went to Takalani. They could not find Vuyo. They went to Randfontein and received a number to call. They called the neighbors. They discovered that Vuyo was in Cullinan. Mr. and Mrs. Ngondane went to Cullinan on the 2nd July 2016. Found Vuyo there, looking for him, sickly and unhappy. The record of transfers and deaths at Cullinan record that Vuyo was at Enka and then transferred to Cullinan Center. However, Enka had already been closed down in 2016. Mr. Ngondwane did not know anything about this. And I later go on to describe how his body was found. And I talk about how Ms. Dladla found the body of her brother. I move on to talk about many others, Ms. Tejani, Ms. Mumalo, Ms. Pangela. I write about the description of Ms. Buitumelo.
We'll do so. Our submission remains that they are not witnesses unless they have given oral testimony before you. And there is a submission. Statements that were more than statements were handed in without objection.
Most carelessly. And at the close of this scornful tale of every deceased bodies were distraught families who had to find the remains of their loved ones and bury them with their very meager financial resources. And there were survivors. Besides 144 mental health care users who died as a result of their move out of Life Esidimeni facilities, 1,418 other patients were exposed to torture, trauma, morbidity, amongst other results, but survived. They have been returned to Life Esidimeni facilities for continued care. Of the known survivors, the state was unable to ascertain the whereabouts of 44 mental health care users. They remain missing persons. Short of death, the survivors, and so too their family members, were exposed to trauma, morbidity, and to torture, to which the deceased mental health care users succumbed. Families of several survivors found their voice and came before the hearing to narrate the ordeal of their loved ones and their own pain and suffering. The account that follows are a mere glimpse of the torture of the tortures that the survivors lived through, and are additional to the conditions that at NGOs where most health survivors were users. And I go on at great length to describe the circumstances of Mr. Kanyuseli Banzi, Mr. Sizwe Nkosi, Mr. Sibusi Songwenya, Ms. Nojabe, Ms. Baloy's elder sister, Ms. Tlatle, Mandla David Khadebe. And I detailed and record their stories with considerable detail. The important human stories, and harrowing as they are, I found you'll find the courage to go and read a description of the circumstances and conditions under which those who still live have survived. The circumstances of the mental health care users who survived the Marathon Project are expectedly many, varied and uneven. There are indeed differences in the kind and extent and impact of the morbidity, trauma and even torture the patients on the one hand and the families on the other had to withstand. But equally, there are strong and stubborn common contours that are traceable across the experience of mental health care users spawned by the project. Next, I tend to describe the government's obligations towards mental health care users. And I do so because the knowledge thereof were singularly absent within the government itself and perhaps within our state. Now, there's no rift between the parties over the obligation of the government towards mental health care users. They are sourced first and foremost from our Constitution, applicable domestic legislation and policy, all understood in the light of our country's international obligations. Our Constitution leaves no doubt that we are bound by our properly assumed international obligations. And when interpreting domestic legislations, we must prefer a construction that is consistent with international law. And despite the preeminence of our Constitution, it is more convenient to dispose of international obligations quickly and hopefully to get to the outcome. First are international law obligations. The starting point must be the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And its preamble reminds us, and I quote, the recognition of the inherent dignity and of the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family, the code ends. And the declaration warns that disregard and contempt for human rights have resulted in barbarous acts which have outraged the conscience of mankind, close quote. These are words which were said nearly 100 years ago. For now, let it suffice to record a few pointed provisions of the declaration that are here opposite and have found their way into our own Constitution. Everyone has a right to life, to liberty, to security of the person. No one shall be subjected to torture or cruel or inhuman or degrading treatment or punishment. Everyone has a right to a standard of living adequate for the health and well-being of himself and of his family, and I'll add her family, including food, clothing, housing, medical care, and necessary social services, and the right to security in the event of unemployment, of sickness, of disability, of widowhood, of old age, and lack of livelihood and circumstances beyond her or his control. The next important piece of international law emerges from our continent is the African Charter of Human and People's Rights. It too seeks to guarantee protection of conventional fundamental rights as well as people rights within the African context. It roundly proclaims that human beings are inviolable. Every human being shall be entitled to respect for his life and the integrity of his person. I'll add her person. All the people there wrote about men only. And no one may be arbitrarily deprived of this right. And the African Charter prescribes all forms of human degradation, including torture, cruel, inhuman, degrading punishment and treatment. Of immediate relevance is Article 16 of the Charter. It provides every individual shall have the right to enjoy the best attainable state of physical and mental health. State parties to the present Charter shall take the necessary measures to protect the health of their people and to ensure that they receive medical attention when they are sick. Article 16 ends. Then there's a Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability. Again, an international convention, and it's of immediate relevance. You'll find all the references in the reasons for this award. Its primary mission is to promote, protect, and ensure the full and equal enjoyment of all human rights and fundamental freedoms by all persons with disabilities, and to promote respect for their inherent dignity. Persons with disability include those who have a long-term physical, mental, intellectual, or sensory impairment, which upon interaction with various barriers may hinder their full and effective participation in society on equal basis with others. And the core principle of this convention is the respect for difference and acceptance of persons of disability as part of the human diversity and part of humanity. And the convention goes on in great detail. I've set it out for all scholars of international law and local lawyers to go and look at it. And even closer home is the 1991 United Nations Principles for the Protection of Persons with Mental Illness and for the improvement of mental health care. It sets out a number of principles, and I have described all of those principles which are relevant to these circumstances. And they are completely crucial, but more importantly, they bind our nation. They are part of the law in our land by incorporation. Our Constitution binds all organs of state and every state official entrusted with public power. All public office bearers and state officials who made decisions on the Marathon Project were bound to observe constitutional dictates. By parity of reason, when organs of state, as the facts here show, entrusted non-governmental organizations and intern NGOs assumed duties of an organ of state in relation to affected mental health care users, the NGOs acquired related constitutional obligations. The NGOs exercised delegated powers of the state. The NGOs acted in the name, in the place, in the state and authority of the state, whose duty it was to provide adequate care to mental health care users. As NGOs voluntarily assumed the care of affected mental health care users, they were bound to exercise their mandate lawfully and in a reasonable manner. The concerned state organs, and indeed NGOs, were obliged to respect, to promote, protect constitutional entitlements of users. These include their inherent human dignity, their right to life, freedom and security of the person, especially the right not to be tortured in any way, and not to be treated or punished in cruel, inhuman, and degrading way. Mental health care users were entitled to have access to adequate health care, services, and sufficient food and water. In turn, their families and interested parties acting on their behalf or in the public interest were entitled to demand that the fundamental rights of the users should not be infringed or threatened. The Constitution goes further to impose overarching duties on wielders of public power. As elected office bearers, and so too those in public service, as they go about their duties, they must first and foremost be faithful to the law. They must act within the strictures of the law. They must eschew unlawfulness. They must not elevate their personal or arbitrary or political or other preferences above or in breach of binding law of our nation. There is a bare minimum of the constitutional tenet of the rule of law. And embedded in our democratic practice are the founding values of openness, of responsiveness, of accountability in the exercise of public power that affects all people in our land, and certainly that impinges on defenseless mental health care users and their families. Our democratic project sets admirably high principles for officials in the public service. The public administration must occur within the precincts of said values and principles. These include a high standard of professional ethics, using public resources in an efficient and economic and effective manner, providing services impartially, fairly, equitably, and without bias, and being responsive to people's needs, and engaging and encouraging the public to participate in policy making. In addition, public administration must be accountable and transparent by providing the public with timely, accessible, and accurate information, something we simply did not see in Project Marathon. Here it is useful to record that the Constitution expressly, albeit self-evidently, imposes duty of fidelity to the law, to transparency, to accountability on the member of the Executive Council. It says so in so many words in relation to an MEC. To cut to the chase, Ms. Mahlangu was responsible for the executive function related to healthcare in the province as assigned by the Premier. She was obliged to act in accordance with the Constitution. She was accountable collectively and individually, as the Constitution tells us, to the legislature for performance of her functions and duties. And she bore the duty to give full and regular reports to the legislature. What does our domestic legislation tell us? We have written laws ourselves. The key piece of applicable domestic legislation are the National Health Act and the Mental Health Care Act. Both in theory are animated by and seek to give effect to the progressive realization of the constitutional right of access to health care services, to an environment that is not harmful, and to health and well-being of people and the protection of vulnerable groups, including women, children, older persons, and with disabilities. I single out a few relevant provisions of each of the statutes that have been made by us in our Parliament. The National Health Act requires a person in charge of a health establishment to ensure that a health record containing such information as may be prescribed is created and maintained at health establishments for every user of health services. It is significant that a health establishment include a private institution, facility or building, whether for profit or not, that is operated or designed to provide any health care services of a wide spectrum. What does this mean for us? There is no doubt that NGOs that were used in the Marathon project were health establishments as defined and bore the duty to keep a health record to every user of health care services in their care and to provide appropriate mental health care. A viewer, could you pour some water for me, please? Oroba King. Now, the National Health Care Act prescribes duties of the Executive Council, the head of the department, and requires provincial health plans must conform to national policy. The germane national policy, the Mental Health Care Act, is a national mental health care policy framework and strategic plan. Its mission is equally aspirational. From infancy to old age, the framework tells us, the mental health and well-being of all South Africans will be enabled through the provision of evidence-based, affordable, effective promotion, prevention, treatment, and rehabilitation interventions. In partnership between providers, users, carers, communities, human rights of people of mental illness will be upheld. They will be provided with care and support, and they will be integrated into the normal community life. The code ends. That is the standard we have set for ourselves. The objective of the policy are to be welcomed and well in line with our constitutional international treaty obligations. They include the objective to promote, to protect human rights of people living with mental illness, to increase decentralized, integrated primary mental health services, which include community-based care. Whilst the policy framework places considerable hope on community-based care into the future, it also candidly warns of the high risk of rapid and premature use of community-based mental health care. And I quote from the framework: "The institutionalization has progressed at a rapid rate in South Africa without the necessary development of community-based services. This has led to a high number of homeless, mentally ill people living with mental illness in prisons and revolving door patterns of care." The code ends. The policy framework envisages that the Provincial Department of Health will license and regulate the provision of community-based mental health care services by NGOs, such as community, residential care, daycare services, and halfway house. In the precincts and the control of Regulation 43 of the General Regulations of the Mental Health Care. You do that provided you comply with the law. The provisions authorize the Minister or Director General of National Departments, member of the Executive Council or head of the department in the province to be signatories to licenses to non-governmental organizations, and not Dr. Manamela, who's not a head of the department. Only a few observations on the Act should suffice. It is a principal legislation that regulates mental health care. The Act carries wide and far-reaching meaning of mental health care user and mental health care providers. A mental health care user includes next of kin or family of the mental health care user. And if below 18 or is incapable of taking decisions, equally important is that the mental health care provider includes any person providing health care to the user. It's enough to note that the patients and their families who were affected by the Marathon Project were mental health care users. On the evidence, virtually all patients affected by the Marathon Project were incapable of taking decisions. Also, the non-governmental organizations that assumed their care, as I said earlier, under the Act, were deemed to be themselves mental health care providers and therefore bound by the requirements of the Act. And the objects of the Act divulge no surprises. And for all the lawyers and mental health care users, you could come and read this. It sets out what our own law sets out. But what is relevant here is that the decision of the head of a health establishment, the legislative scheme boasts of an internal review mechanism. It is the Mental Health Review Board that must provide an independent oversight role. Its members are appointed and may be removed by the MEC on specified grounds, but again, only after inquiry. For purposes of this arbitration, the most useful attribute of the review board is the power and obligation to consider appeals against decisions of the head of establishment. Relevant here is that a decision by the head of a health establishment to transfer a patient is susceptible to review and reversal by the review board. But the evidence tells us that in the Marathon Project, Dr. Manamela ordered heads of health establishments consent to discharge or move users gratuitously and contrary to the detailed prescripts of the legislation of our country. The chairperson and members of the review boards knew about the en masse discharge of mental health care users from Life Esidimeni facilities and did absolutely nothing about this. They raised not even a finger to protect the users. In her evidence, the chairperson, Mrs. Masondo, a multiple qualified nursing sister and a psychiatrist nurse of many years of standing and vast experience, admitted that she and members of the review board were pleased to draw handsome monthly salaries from the department, and yet they neither apprised themselves of their statutory tasks, let alone performing them. Also, the review board may set its own procedure for accomplishing its mandate. In other words, it was within its gift to take reasonable steps to fulfill its independent oversight role, to advance or protect the vital interests of mental health care users who met their demise or torture and their families. The Ombuds correctly described the review board as moribund during the torturous and murderous Marathon project. Its chairperson admitted that the review board did not fulfill any of its statutory obligations during the Marathon project. This because she claimed she believed she worked for and reported to Ms. Mahlangu, who hired and paid her. She thought the review board had no power to countermand the decision to move or transfer the users. She claimed that she was unaware of her statutory obligations to review and where appropriate to set aside decisions to transfer or move patients in order to advance and protect the vital interests of mental health care users and their families. One fleeting reading of the legislation regulating the review board will show that Mrs. Masondo was less than truthful when she pleaded ignorance of the duties of the review board. She and her review board chose to bend over and comply with what the department wanted to do in order to protect their appointments and remuneration at the expense of mental health care users and their families. The review board deserted its statutory duties for personal convenience of its members and for fear of retribution from the leadership of the department. I've spelled out the regulatory regime in considerable detail. In my view, this was necessary, given the vast human tragedy in the form of deaths, torture, and survival of defenseless mental health care users. Also because since 1994, our state has erected globally admirable and compliant regulatory regime for the care of mental health care users. Our laws are truly beautiful. Its provisions are by and large in sync with our international human rights and mental health care norms of a very high order. But what stands out is the breadth and the depth and the frequency of the arrogant and deeply disgraceful disregard of constitutional obligations, disregard of other law, disregard of mental health care norms and ethics by an organ of state, its leaders, and its employees. The final questions are what would be just and equitable redress, including compensation, and what form the arbitration award should assume. To that end, I quickly look at the constitutional breaches underlying the claim for compensation, and thereafter tell you what the decision is. The claimants contend that the severe constitutional breaches against the mental health care users who have died and those who have survived and their families have occurred. Thus, their claims are for damages beyond the common law damages and flow from severe breaches by the government of the constitutional rights of the claimants? Well, as you've heard by now, the bridges are self-evident. I'm duty-bound, and I do record them nonetheless. You've heard already that the primal genesis, or if you like, the original sin, that led to the torture and death of mental patients and torture of survivors is the termination of a service-level agreement with Life Esidimeni. I've already found that after an extensive evaluation of the evidence, the reasons that Ms. Mahlangu and Dr. Silebano and their department have advanced for terminating the service contract with Life Esidimeni are untrue. As I've already found, the evidence of the National Minister, the Premier, and the Member of Executive Council for Finance have shown that the reasons are fabricated and patently false. More so, the reasons are not properly related to the governmental purpose they claim they were pursuing. In short, besides the reasons for the termination being untruthful, the decision to terminate the contract was irrational, as I've said earlier, and in blatant breach of the law and of the Constitution. The requirement of rationality in decision-making is a subset of the rule of law, a founding value of our Constitution. It compels a person who exercises public power to pursue only lawful governmental purpose. And that means what she chooses must be properly related to the outcome she seeks to achieve. A decision maker wielding public power may not act arbitrarily, without good cause, or for no reason. Least still, a decision maker may not act for an ulterior purpose, particularly when she makes a decision that impinges adversely on the rights of other people. Absent rationality in the use of public power, arbitrariness and tyranny will flourish. The death and torture in Life Esidimeni tragedy stemmed from an irrational and arrogant use of public power. I invited Ms. Mahlangu and Dr. Silebano several times to explain the true reasons why they ended the contract. They failed to do so. They diverted responsibility, so they thought, by saying it was, open quote, a decision of the collective, close quote. Both admitted that each had the power to stop the termination of the contract, but never explained why they did not. None could explain why it was urgent to cancel the contract. Here is the point. The irrational and thus unconstitutional decision was the reason for the death and torture that ensued. And yet the claimants, and indeed the nation, knows not the true reason why the triggering decision was taken by powerful government officials against defenseless mental health care users and their families. Absent the truth, closure of the claimants is hardly possible. Now, this wanton, arbitrary, unaccounted decision has caused so much pain and suffering and stress and trauma and morbidity, and in my view is the very serious breach of constitutional obligations by the state and its servants. Such a breach, together with other considerations, will weigh heavily on the character of the just and equitable redress I will order shortly. The right to human dignity is critical to a meaningful departure from the oppression of apartheid era. Colonialism and apartheid were the antithesis of human dignity. The recognition of self-worth of each individual, regardless of their circumstances, is a prerequisite for the achievement of our constitutional values and of our democratic project. And we dare not depart from them. Every element of the Marathon Project trampled on human dignity of the mental health care users when they were still alive, the dignity of the mental health care users after they passed away, the dignity of their families, members who watched their loved ones waste away and die, powerless to do anything to prevent it. The violations of the dignity here are as many as they are plain to see. Not only were the mental health care users stripped of their dignity in life and death, but their families were also treated to subhuman treatment, they were treated to subhuman and devoid of any worth. Their entitlements to participate in the decisions about the health care of their loved ones was disregarded, as was their right to information. Their grief was brushed aside. The emotional distress arising from the trauma they went through was undermined and used to marginalize them. The evidence shows the effort of many family members who took to search for their loved ones, the indignity of being confronted with dehydrated, emaciated, unwell mental health care users in dingy and unkept NGOs seems a fairly obvious and brutal indignity. As I've recorded earlier, the families finding their loved ones deceased and in some instances decomposed was a hurtful affront. And the human worth and the value of Ubuntu that teaches us caring, communal sharing, and human solidarity was clearly absent. I find that the claimants, in the extended sense of mental health care users and their families, or next of kin as described in our own law, were stripped of their dignity in the way that the government treated them. Before their death, mental health care users were owed a duty of protecting and upholding their dignity. The government failed them dismally. In the face of the government in fact, the government proactively invaded the multi-constitutional guarantees already existing despite warnings and protests from organized clinicians, psychiatrists, psychologists, and formations of the families. The right not to be treated in cruel, inhuman, and degrading way is also self-standing right, and it emanates from our Constitution. It's related to the dignity right, but it travels further. It does not only require people to be treated respectfully in a dignified manner, in accordance with human worth, but also targets proactive and systematic acts that are not only unkind, but are also hateful and directed at bodily and psychological hurt and harassment. All the facts here point to cruelty, antithesis of empathy and caring. And our Constitution, that invaded right, promises everyone not to be tortured in any way. During argument before me, the state readily considered that the ordeal of all mental health care users amounted to torture. That concession is well made. That view is one held by at least 3 of the experts before us: Dr. Mvuyiso Talatala, Ms. Coralie Trotter, and Professor Ames Dye. And I quote their opinions extensively, which you can read at your own leisure. Indeed, the state breached the protection of mental health users against torture of any kind, which the Constitution forbids. The right to family life is an associational right that flows from the collection of other interrelated rights, such as the right to dignity, equality, freedom, the right of a child to family and parental care. And in Dawood, the court explained that human beings are social beings whose humanity is expressed through relationship with others. And I go on to set out the way in which these associational rights, and to those who are under the age of 18, right to family care, were invaded. There's another whole set of other constitutional breaches that are important. Our Constitution, as I said, requires public officials to be responsive to the plight and reasonable requests and demands of citizenry. Ms. Mahlangu and Dr. Manamela insinuated that they were entitled to empty life Esidimeni facilities because the families had abandoned their loved ones and had no one to give notice of the closure of life as Esidimeni. There may have been family members who had not visited their loved ones at facilities over an extended period. In fact, claimants in arbitration relate to a fraction of the total number of users who died or survived the ordeal. However, that can hardly be true of the claimants in these proceedings. That charge against the present claimants is without purchase and falls to be rejected. The claimants in these proceedings are the ones who took rigorous and persistent steps to procure these arbitration proceedings. The evidence showed that the families protested over planned mass transfer of their loved ones. From the first day they met Ms. Mahlangu at the Waverley facility of Life Esidimeni around May 2016. They formed an activist and representative family committee. They negotiated and pleaded with the department, including with Ms. Mahlangu, Dr. Manamela, and Mr. Musinogi, not to move their loved ones in vain. The families succeeded to delay the mass transfer, but only for 3 months. They engaged public interest attorneys from Section 27 to intercede on their behalf, who in turn wrote tomes of letters of demand and pleadings to Ms. Mahlangu, Dr. Silibano, and Dr. Manamela, and to the department before and after the marathon project had started. Families organized public protest marches. They tendered memoranda of protest to Ms. Mahlangu, Dr. Silibano, and Dr. Manamela. They alerted print and electronic media to their plight and that of their loved ones. And after the blind transfers of their loved ones, families went to search for them at far-flung NGOs. After the death of some, concerned families went out to retrieve the bodies of their loved ones and buried them at their own cost without the government's assistance. The point here is less about what the families did, but rather about what Ms. Mahlangu, Dr. Silibano, and Dr. Manamela refused to do. They refused to stop the mass transfer of mental health care users to NGOs, not fit for purpose. They chose, knowing all the facts and the risks, not to be responsive to the reasonable and lawful requests and demands of claimants. Their attitude was perhaps summarized by Ms. Mahlangu, who on one occasion retorted, "If I was a prophet, Justice, I would have had foresight," close quote. Our Constitution hopes for public servants who listen to the genuine and reasonable grievances of citizens and other people within our borders, with concern and readiness to respond, to alleviate their concern, and certainly protect and promote the rights the law affords them. This did not happen here. The public service motto of Batu Pili was trampled upon. That is just as true about the requirement of accountability. I've already recorded how Ms. Mahlangu's answers to questions in the provincial legislature on deaths in the marathon project were objectively inaccurate and misleading. She explained that she was fed inaccurate and inadequate information on deaths of mental health care users by Dr. Manamela, who prepared her answers to the legislature. Lastly, there is the larger question of accountability for the entire marathon project and its toxic aftermath. In their testimony, Ms. Mahlangu, Dr. Silibano, and Dr. Manamela each acknowledged the pain caused to families by the death of users or the torture of survivors. For that, each apologized in a tearful or near tearful way. And yet, despite their obvious position of authority and power, each refused to take full responsibility for the administrative and the political decisions that led to the tragedy of this proportion. Dr. Manamela played the victim. Yes, she was the head of the directorate, but she acted on instructions from above. Once the decision to terminate had been taken, she had to plan and implement the mass removals of users. She had no option, she said. She was ordered by Dr. Selebano and Ms. Mahlangu to move the patients, and she promptly carried out orders. She knew that the removal was not in accordance with the law, but the order was from above, she said. When she was confronted in cross-examination, she said she knew that she was not obliged to carry out an unlawful instruction, but carried it out nonetheless. And it led to the death and torture of many helpless patients under her care. She claimed that she could not reasonably foresee that patients under the care of a directorate might lose their lives or be subjected to extended, degrading treatment and torture. Dr. Manamela was integral to the decision to end Life Esidimeni contract. She was not a victim and dutiful servant, but a leader and a principal decision maker. The evidence shows that she produced a plan to transfer the patients en masse. She was physically present at removal sites. She visited NGOs and must have known of their parlors conditions. She could reasonably foresee that some patients will be exposed to death. Will be exposed to health care inferior to the one they enjoy at Life Esidimeni, and that some will suffer and that others might die. And they did. After her evidence, she resigned before the internal disciplinary processes were completed. Dr. Selebano was head of the department at all times. He signed the termination agreement and had the power to revoke that decision. He repeatedly said he was accountable as head of the department. He says he was opposed to the Marathon project. He asked Mr. Musinogi to write a letter to Ms. Mahlangu pleading for an extension of the contract because he could not. He was afraid of Ms. Mahlangu. He implemented the Marathon project out of fear. Ms. Mahlangu was his political principal, and he had to follow her, even her unlawful instructions. This is indeed an extraordinary tale. A medical doctor turned a government chief executive of provincial health pleads fear in decision-making. I'm unable to accept that he did not make a conscious, albeit unlawful, decision to terminate the contract. The documentation shows that he directed and chaired meetings on the project and its implementation. His claim that because he was perched at the top of the departmental activities, he knew nothing about the transfers, tortures, and deaths of patients is plainly untrue. He denied, wrongly in my view, that he was bound by the professional code as a medical doctor because he's no longer an active clinician. All facts point to him having chosen to go along with and lead the Marathon project. He must have foreseen the death and torture might ensue, and he nonetheless allowed the project to go on, and death and torture did indeed ensue. After his evidence, he resigned from his post before facing disciplinary processes. Ms. Mahlangu too denied she was administratively responsible for the mass deaths and torture related to the Marathon project. She mentioned the department's plan to terminate the contract in a planning meeting, according to her, in which the Premier presided. She said that the cancellation decision was of a collective and not hers alone. She testified that the decision was by her and all her senior people in her department. She said she knew nothing about the implementation of Marathon Project, and Dr. Manamela and Dr. Silvano lied to her about the transfers, the conditions at NGOs, and the death and torture that ensued. She further said that Dr. Malema gave her false and inaccurate figures of death and told her that the care of NGOs was adequate when supported by district officers. She could not say why her senior colleagues would lie to her about a project so important. I must say that Ms. Mahlangu resigned from her position as a member of the Executive Council as soon as she had seen the findings of the Ombud. In my view, she took political responsibility for the horrid failing in the departments she was in charge of. However, on all accounts, she was at the helm of the Marathon Project. She was the ultimate leader and commander of the project. Dr. Silvano, Dr. Manamela, and Mr. Musinogi testified about how she ordered them to ensure that the project is pursued relentlessly. One such example is when Mr. Musinogi pleaded for postponement of the project. Ms. Mahlangu turned to him and asked whether he worked for life as Esidimeni. That was enough to stop all of them in their bid to postpone the project. Dr. Manamela testified repeatedly that she implemented the Marathon Project on the firm orders of Ms. Mahlangu. On the other hand, Dr. Silibana repeatedly said that he was afraid to contradict Ms. Mahlangu. As the ultimate leader of the project and member of the Executive Council, she failed to explain why she allowed so many lives of defenseless mental health care users to be placed at risk for no good reason. She was aware of the full risks of implementing the Marathon Project. She ignored and indeed brushed aside the warnings at many levels that death might ensue, and death did ensue. Her plea of ignorance that Dr. Silibana and Dr. Manamela lied to her about the facts related to the Marathon Project is patently untrue. It is a response of convenience in the face of an ominous tragedy. Her overall conduct in relation to the Marathon Project was irrational, was inexplicable, highly reckless, and led to the death of at least 144 mental health care users and 1,418 survivors of the torture at NGOs. Her stance that she could not reasonably foresee that death might ensue or that mental health care users might be subjected to torture is untenable and cannot be believed. She acted with impunity, thinking that she'll get away with it because the users and their families were vulnerable and poorly resourced. She acted with an ulterior motive that remains concealed, even after many days of evidence before this hearing. All we can hope for is that one day the true reason for the conception and the implementation of the Marathon Project will see the light of day. Equitable redress. This is an arbitration. The jurisdiction of the arbitrator stems from the arbitration agreement and subsequent pleadings. The party has stipulated that, absent an agreement on the quantum of compensation, the arbitrator must make a binding award on equitable redress and measures to facilitate closure. Redress, the agreement explains, includes appropriate compensation for affected families, and whether on a group or individual basis. The arbitrator may determine any further form of redress he deems appropriate, says the agreement. On closure, the arbitration agreement also presets measures that are likely to facilitate closure. At the end of the hearing, the government tendered a global amount of 200,000 rand per claimant family for estimated funeral expenses and common law damages arising from psychological injury and emotional shock, full stop. Some of the claimants accepted the tender. All claimants in slight variations were emphatic that beyond general damages for which the state is obviously liable, the pervasive, egregious, and uncaring wanton violation of constitutional rights of all mental health care users affected and their families call for equitable redress, which must include constitutional damages. To the extent that this head of damages is settled, I'm obliged to include it in the award I will make as the arbitration agreement commands. The government resists an award for what the claimants call constitutional damages in the region of 1 million rand to 1,500 million rand. The core reasoning of the government seems to be twofold. First, once the claimant has been compensated under the common law, she or he may not rely on the Constitution to seek equitable redress. All civil claims, the argument ran, must be brought only under the rubric of the common law. On this reasoning, the stratagem of the government was to settle the common law damages and then contend that the claimants may no longer rely on the Constitution for equitable redress. For this proposition, the government developed the following argument. First, it relied on a Minister of Police versus Mboweni and another, the Supreme Court of Appeal case. In that case, Supreme Court of Appeal was seized with an appeal in which the High Court had found that a child whose parent had died because of unlawful conduct of a third party could not claim constitutional damages for infringement of the right to parental care. The Supreme Court held that the question of remedy can only arise after the relevant right has been properly identified and pleaded, or admitted facts show that the right had been infringed. An inquiry into damages cannot take place in the air. It must be an inquiry into the damages arising from the identified wrong. The government went on to submit that once the constitutional right alleged to be breached has been identified, there remains a further issue of whether constitutional damages are appropriate constitutional remedy for that breach. I find no fault in this submission, but the difficulty with this submission is this. In this arbitration, there can be no doubt that a legion of constitutional rights have been breached, and each has been meticulously identified and proven by uncontested facts. In Mboweni, the Supreme Court of Appeal concluded that the claimant could have vindicated the loss of parental care under the common law claim of loss of support. In doing so, the court relied on two cases of the Constitutional Court in which I wrote the judgment for the court. And for those who are lawyers and interested, I've quoted the sections that the government rely on in the footnote. In effect, the government is arguing that the claimants should have converted all their claims to common law claims, and that if not, they should be non-suited. Neither the constitutional law cases relied on, nor Mboweni, case of the SCA, is authority for that proposition. The cases simply teach that a remedy under Section 38 of the Constitution may be vindicated by the common law mode of pleading and claim. The cases do not mean that a party is barred from relying on the Constitution where the breaches defy common law formulation. It would be strange, if not bizarre, if a claim under the supreme law would be denied vindication simply because it could not fit into a common law framework. If that were so, the constitutional remedies would be granted only subject to the common law. That would be remarkably retrogressive understanding of the hierarchy of sources of law in our country. It is important to restate that the common law is subservient to the Constitution and not the other way round. More importantly, the claim of the claimants in this arbitration for compensation arising from invasive and pervasive violation of constitutional guarantees by the government cannot be readily couched in common law terms. Simply put, there are no common law equivalents to it. What is the common law equivalent of a claim based on the state's breach of a right of access to healthcare, right of access to food, right of access to water, freedom from torture, protection from cruel, degrading, and human treatment? Similarly, what is the common law equivalent of a claim against the state for breaching the rule of law, for disregarding protections provided by legislation that is meant to give effect to constitutional guarantees, or a claim arising for breach of internal obligations in the Mental Health Care Act? And on the facts here, all these breaches together led to the agonizing devastation for families of the deceased, survivors, and their families. In effect, the government has invited me to squeeze this pervasive and wreaking violation of our Constitution and many valuable laws into psychological injury and shock claims, for which 180,000 rand might be the going rate in trial courts under the common law. That I do not dispute, but I decline that invitation. This is a matter of massive proportion to the utterly defenseless mental health care users who deserve every care in the world and every protection and vindication of their constitutional right. A tribunal like this can afford them. The parties have agreed that the arbitrator must determine equitable redress in the form of compensation. In their wisdom, they've also allowed the arbitrator's discretion to determine other forms of equitable redress. I can find no hint that the parties sought to leave their fate in the narrow and dated strictures of the common law only. The full complexity and uniqueness of the facts here were well known to the parties when they concluded the arbitration agreement. The parties did not seek to restrict the arbitrator's power only to common law claims. I will have regard to all the circumstances that I have so painstakingly and in detail sketched earlier in order to reach what I trust is an equitable redress and will have to achieve closure for all concerned. In the award, I will not differentiate amongst different classes of claimants. No party has argued that I should do so. Such a differentiation would indeed be treacherous, difficult to make, and impracticable, given the high number of claimants and the variety of circumstances under which some users died and other users who are survivors of the torture. The other risk is that such differentiation may be uneven and lead to an unjust outcome. I propose to make a uniform award in favor of each claimant who is a party to this arbitration. I'm not unmindful of the fact that many other potential claimants are not before me in these proceedings. I'm aware of the many public announcements and media advertisements that invited potential claimants. Not all have joined the process. When they find their voice or their way, or they are found, I trust that the government would choose to meet their claims in terms identical to the award than to set up a new litigation or another arbitration process. The award I intend to make will hit the preset elements which the parties believe will bring mental health care users and their families nearer to closure. However, I have declined to order the establishment of a trust in which claimants would contribute part of their award amount, as the claimants suggested. Claimants are free to do so at their election. In any event, the order I will have to make will be long, will be complex, and difficult to enforce. I've declined also to order South African Police Service to investigate criminal charges that obviously arise from the facts of this arbitration. My office has furnished the South African Police with a full record of the proceedings. They must do their work as the law requires of them, and not at my direction. Whilst I have a voice, let me thank the families of the claimants, and the National Minister of Health, and the Premier of Gauteng Province, and the member of the Executive Council of Health Gauteng, the current member of the Executive Council of Health Gauteng, who stayed the course to bring the arbitration to fruition. The logistical and material support to families and arbitration staff was considerable. They represented a contrite, a remorseful, a responsive and accountable government that readily came along to help heal the gaping and personal wounds of so many in our nation. More so, they publicly apologized. In my award, I might require them to do that again. I will, if I were to so specify. All experts who appeared for the parties did so without qualifying fees. I'm grateful for their selflessness. I've been suitably encouraged to donate all my arbitrators' fees to chosen law schools that will hopefully help nurture young women and men committed to the high values of our Constitution and to the calling to defend vulnerable against the abuse of the high and mighty. I would like to express a word of gratitude to all the attorneys and counsel who participated in these proceedings. I'd like to thank the Ombud, Professor Makhoba, without whom the completion of the arbitration proceedings would not have been possible. And lastly, and certainly, and not least, I am grateful, firstly, to all the counsel who participated in these proceedings, who have shown remarkable loyalty and professionalism. And lastly, and certainly not least, I'm grateful to Aviwe Sivuyile Khala. What kind of name is that? Khala. And Ubaking Terence van Dijk for their remarkable loyalty and professionalism they brought in support of my role as arbitrator. I make the following award. 1. The Government of the Republic of South Africa, as represented by the National Minister of Health, the Premier of Gauteng, and member of the Executive Council of Health Gauteng Province, hereinafter the government, is ordered to pay the agreed amount of 20,000 rand to each of the claimants listed in Annexures A and B in respect of funeral expenses. 2. The government is ordered to pay 180,000 rand to each of the claimants listed in Annexures A, B, and C in respect of damnable damages for shock and psychological trauma. 3. The government is ordered to pay 1 million rand to each of the claimants listed in Annexures A, B, and C as appropriate relief and compensation for the government's unjustifiable and reckless breaches of Section 1A and C and D of Section 7, Section 10, Section 12.1D, Section 12.1E, Section 27.1A, Section 27.1B, Section 195.1A, B, D, E, F, and G of the Constitution, and multiple contraventions of the National Health Act 61 of 2003, the Mental Health Act 17 of 2002, that caused the death of 144 healthcare users and the pain and suffering and torture of 1,418 mental health care users who survived and their families. As required by the arbitration agreement, the amounts in paragraphs 1, 2, and 3 must be paid by the government in lump sum not later than 3 months from the date of the publication of this award, and in any event not later than the 19th of June 2018. Paragraph 5. Within 30 days of the publication of this award, the government must make available the services of qualified mental health care professionals who must assess the counseling and support needs of each of the claimants listed in Annexures A, B, and C, and up to 3 members of each claimant's family. The assessed counseling and support services must be provided immediately, and in any event not later than 30 days after the assessment of the counseling and support services, except if any of the claimants or their families in writing decline the counseling and support. Paragraph 6 of the order. Pursuant to the arbitration agreement between the parties, the government is directed to construct, at its exclusive expense, and within 12 months from the date of publication of this award, a monument at an appropriate prominent location to commemorate the suffering and loss caused by the Gauteng Mental Health Marathon Project, and to serve as a reminder to future generations of the human dignity and vulnerability of mental health care users. Paragraph 7. Pursuant to the undertaking by the member of the Executive Council for Health Gauteng Province, Dr. Gwen Ramokgopa, the government is ordered to provide to the Health Ombud, appointed in terms of Section 81 of the National Health Act 61 of 2003, and the claimants listed in Annexures A, B, and C, or their representatives, the recovery plan, whose purpose is to achieve a systemic change and improvement in the provision and delivery of mental health care by the Department of Health of the province of Gauteng. The parties to these proceedings are permitted to share the recovery plan with interested members of the public. Paragraph 7b.